The storm over the ruined battlefield had not been natural. Grafia Lucifuge knew this the moment she stepped through the scorched tree line and felt the air still crackling with a magic that did not belong to any of the noble houses she could name. The last skirmish between the old Satan loyalists and the new government had ended hours ago, and cleanup teams had been sweeping the fields since dawn, gathering the wounded, counting the dead, salvaging what could be salvaged from a war that had cost the Underworld more than anyone wanted to admit. She had not expected to find a child. He was wrapped in a scrap of burned cloth that might once have been a banner, tucked into the hollow of an uprooted tree as if someone had meant to hide him and had not lived long enough to come back. Grafia crouched beside him, her silver eyes narrowing as she reached out with a careful thread of magic to check for injury, for curses, for anything that might explain why an infant had survived a battle that leveled half a forest. He was warm. He was breathing. And when her magic brushed against him, something in his chest answered it, a small flare of power that had no business existing in a child that young, coiled tight, and sleeping the way a seed sleeps before it becomes a tree too large for the ground that holds it. There was no scent of any known clan on him. No mark, no seal, no signature that matched a bloodline. He was, as far as any spell she cast could determine, simply a child who had appeared in the middle of a war, unclaimed by history. She lifted him anyway. The imperial palace of Pandemonium sat apart from the political heart of the Underworld the way an anchor sits apart from the ship it holds steady, old in a way the newly risen Satan houses were not, older than the war that had put Cersex and his peers on their thrones. Its ruler answered to no faction, held no seat on the Council of Satans, and yet every one of the four deferred to him in matters that mattered enough to threaten the peace itself. He was called, simply, the Emperor, a title that predated the very idea of Satans and had survived every upheaval the Underworld had ever produced by never once reaching for more power than was needed to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. His name, spoken rarely and never carelessly, was Bahram Vashel. Grafia found him in the North Garden, standing over a bed of black roses that bloomed only under moonlight, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man who had spent centuries learning patience the hard way. He did not turn when she approached. He rarely needed to. "You found something on the battlefield," he said before she had spoken a word. "A child, Your Majesty." She held the boy a little higher, so what light there was could fall across his sleeping face. "Unclaimed. No clan signature, no seal, no record of birth that I can trace. And yet, there is power in him. Sealed, but immense. I have never felt anything quite like it." The Emperor turned then, and for the first time in longer than Grafia could remember, something that was not quite surprise crossed his ancient features. He crossed the garden without hurry and looked down at the child in her arms for a long moment, long enough that the black roses behind him seemed to lean in, curious in the way old magic sometimes was. "May I?" She passed the boy over without hesitation. Whatever else could be said about Bahram Vashel, and there was a great deal that could be said, no one who knew him doubted that a child was safer in his hands than almost anywhere else in the Underworld. He held the boy the way a man holds something he has been waiting for without knowing it, and when the child stirred and opened his eyes, brown and unfocused and entirely too calm for an infant who had survived what this one had survived, the Emperor went very still. "Do you feel it?" he asked, not quite a question. "I do. That is not a devil's power." "Not fully. There is something coiled inside him that answers to an older law than ours." He brushed a thumb, gently, over the boy's forehead, and the faintest golden light pulsed beneath the skin there before fading again, as if whatever slept inside the child had simply acknowledged the touch and gone back to sleep. "A sacred gear. And not a minor one. Then he is human. Was, perhaps. What he becomes is a different question entirely." The Emperor looked up, and there was something in his expression that Grafia had seen only a handful of times in all her years of service, a decision being made and already, somehow, finished. "The Council will want to know why a child with no lineage was found alive at the center of a battle that left nothing else standing. They will want to run their tests, draft their reports, and eventually, someone ambitious will want to claim him for whatever he might become. You intend to keep him from that." "I intend," Bahram said, and there was iron under the quiet of his voice now, the kind of iron that had held an empire together for longer than most nations survived, to raise him as my son. Grafia did not argue. It was not her place, and more than that, she found she did not want to. There was something in the stillness of the garden, in the way the child had stopped fussing the moment the Emperor's magic settled around him like a second blanket, that told her this was not a whim. Old rulers did not make whims. They made decisions the way mountains made valleys, slowly and permanently. Does he have a name? No records survive to tell us. The Emperor considered the boy for a long moment, turning the question over the way he turned over every question, weighing it against centuries of precedent and finding, as he so often did, that precedent had nothing useful to offer him here. Issei, he said finally. It suits him. A name with no house attached to it yet, and every house yet to come. He did not explain why the word had come to him. He rarely explained himself to anyone, even Grafia, even after all their years of service and friendship. But when he looked down again at the sleeping child in his arms, something in the old monarch's face softened in a way that no council session, no war council, no political maneuvering of the last 3 centuries had ever managed to produce. Send word to the household staff. Prepare the east wing. And Grafia. Your Majesty? Tell no one of where he was found. Only that the Emperor has named an heir. The rest, the realm can learn in time, once he is strong enough that it will not matter what they think of how he came to us. News that the reclusive Emperor of Pandemonium had taken an heir spread through the underworld with the particular speed reserved for scandal wrapped in a crown. It reached the Satan Council within the week, the great noble houses within the month, and by the time half a year had passed, there was scarcely a devil of consequence who had not formed an opinion on the matter, most of them uncharitable. Sirzex Lucifer, for his part, found the news fascinating rather than alarming, a reaction that put him rather at odds with several of his colleagues. An heir with no bloodline, Seraphal Leviathan said, not for the first time, pacing the length of the council chamber with the restless energy of someone who had run out of better ways to express concern. No clan, no lineage, no political ties to speak of. Do you understand what that means for the balance of power once he comes of age? I understand that Bahram Vashal has never once made a decision without understanding its consequences 3 times better than the rest of us combined, Sirzex said mildly, folding his hands atop the table. If he has chosen to raise this child as his son, I doubt it was done carelessly. That is not reassuring, Sirzex. That is the entire problem, perhaps. He allowed himself a small smile, the kind that made even seasoned politicians nervous, because it so often preceded him being right about something everyone else had missed. Or perhaps it is simply time this realm remembered that power does not always arrive wearing a familiar crest. Ajuka Beelzebub, silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke from where he sat sketching something intricate and mechanical across a sheet of parchment, never quite looking up. The boy carries a sacred gear. I ran an analysis of the residual signature graphia recorded at the discovery site before it faded. It is old. Dragon class, if my instruments read true, and not a common one. That got everyone's attention. Which class? Falbia Mesmodius asked, rousing himself from what had looked very much like sleep. I cannot say with certainty. Not yet. But whatever sleeps inside that child, it is not something the Underworld has seen paired with a devil bloodline before, adopted or otherwise. Ajuka set down his pen and, for the first time in the meeting, looked directly at his fellow Satans. I would suggest we all pay very close attention to how the Emperor chooses to raise him. In the North Garden, far from the council chamber and its arguments, Bahram Vashal sat with the boy asleep against his shoulder and watched the black roses close their petals against the coming dawn, entirely unconcerned with what the rest of the Underworld had decided to think. He had ruled long enough to know that history did not care what anyone expected of it. It simply arrived, fully formed, in whatever shape it chose, and the wisest thing a ruler could do was recognize it when it was still small enough to hold in his arms. Sleep well, Issei, he murmured, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the ancient monarch of Pandemonium found himself smiling at nothing in particular, simply because the future had just become a great deal more interesting than the past. The palace of Pandemonium was not built for children, and for the first several years of his life, Issei was fairly certain the building itself resented having to make an exception for him. The halls were too tall, the ceilings painted with murals of wars fought before the current calendar had a name, and every piece of furniture seemed to have been designed by someone who had never once considered that a small boy might want to climb it. He learned early that the suits of ceremonial armor lining the western corridor were not, in fact, meant to be used as obstacles in whatever game he had invented that week, mostly because Grafia had a way of appearing exactly when he was 3 seconds from finding out the hard way. "You are going to put someone's eye out," she told him once, extracting him from between 2 particularly ornate breastplates with the weary patience of a woman who had been managing the household for longer than the boy had been alive. "Possibly your own. I was being careful. You were being 7. He did not have a good answer to that, so he settled for grinning up at her instead, which had, over the years, become a surprisingly effective strategy for surviving Grafia's disapproval. She did not smile back, not exactly, but something in the set of her shoulders loosened, and that was close enough. His father was not, by any reasonable measure, a warm man. Bahram Vashal had spent longer running an empire than most devils spent alive, and it showed in the careful economy of his words, the way he weighed even simple questions as though they might carry consequences 3 centuries down the line. But he made time, every evening without fail, to sit with Issei in the small study off the library and ask him what he had learned that day, and he listened to the answers with the same attention he gave matters of state, which was, Issei would only understand much later, a rarer gift than any crown. "You let him win at chess again," Grafia observed once, watching from the doorway as father and son argued cheerfully over whether a particular move had been legal. "I did no such thing," the Emperor said, without looking up from the board. "He is simply improving faster than expected." He moved his bishop diagonally through 3 of his own pawns. A bold strategy. It was cheating. It was creative. Bahram finally glanced up, and there was a warmth in his ancient eyes that the council chamber never saw, that the noble houses would have found difficult to reconcile with the man they thought they knew. "He will learn the rules soon enough. Let him enjoy breaking them a while longer." Issei did learn the rules, eventually, and rather more besides. His tutors, hand-selected from across the Underworld's oldest and most demanding academies, quickly discovered that their new pupil possessed a mind better suited to problems that moved than problems that sat still on a page. He struggled through lessons on magical theory and excelled without effort at anything involving strategy, negotiation, or the particular kind of stubborn creativity that let him find a third option in situations everyone else insisted only had 2. "He thinks like a general," his tactics instructor reported to the Emperor, sometime around Issei's 10th year, with the slightly baffled tone of a man who had spent decades trying to teach exactly that skill to devils who had been raised on it since birth. "Not a soldier. A general. He does not ask how to win the battle in front of him. He asks which battle should be fought at all. And the sacred gear? Sealed, as you instructed. It stirs, sometimes, when he is frightened or excited, but it has not manifested. Whatever waits inside him, Your Majesty, it is patient." Bahram had chosen, early on, not to force the boy's dormant power into the open before he was ready to understand what he carried. Ajuka's analysis, refined over years of careful, discreet study, had eventually confirmed what the Emperor already suspected in his bones. The gear sleeping in his son's soul belonged to one of the 2 heavenly dragons, the ancient rivals whose power had shaped the mythology of 3 factions and ended more than one war before it properly began. He told no one outside a very small circle. Not the council. Not the noble houses. Not, for a long while, even Issei himself. "Why not?" Grafia asked him once, during one of their rare private conversations in his study. The fire burned low and the palace quiet around them. "He deserves to know what he carries." "He does. And he will, when carrying that knowledge no longer makes him a target before he is old enough to defend himself." Bahram turned his glass slowly in his hand, watching the firelight catch in the deep red liquid. "There are factions in this realm who would see a heavenly dragon bound to an empty throne as either a weapon to be seized or a threat to be eliminated before it can grow. I would prefer my son have the chance to become a person before the realm decides what use to make of him. And if he grows resentful, learning it so late?" The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was something almost fragile beneath the certainty of his voice, a rare crack in the armor of centuries. then I will have failed him in a smaller way, to spare him a larger one. I have made worse trades in my time, Grafia. I intend to make this one carefully. Issei, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of the quiet debates conducted on his behalf, too busy with the ordinary business of growing up in a very extraordinary household. He learned to fence from a retired general who had once held the Eastern Front alone for 3 days against odds that should have ended differently. He learned diplomacy, in a fashion, from Grafia, who had opinions about court etiquette sharp enough to draw blood and no patience whatsoever for pretense. He learned, from his father, the slower and more difficult art of listening, really listening, to people who disagreed with him, a lesson that would serve him better in the years to come than any spell or sword stroke ever could. He also, somewhat to the household staff's collective despair, learned to sneak out of the palace grounds with a regularity that suggested either remarkable skill or remarkable luck, and possibly both. He was in the lower market district again, the head of palace security reported one afternoon, with the particular flatness of a man delivering news he already knew would not be well received. Buying pastries, apparently, from a stall run by a family with no noble affiliation whatsoever. And nothing, Your Majesty. He paid for them himself, with an allowance he apparently saved for exactly this purpose, spoke politely to the shopkeeper, and returned before anyone noticed he was gone. We only caught him because one of the market vendors recognized the crest on his coin purse and sent word out of caution. Bahram considered this report with an expression that, had anyone besides Grafia been present, might have been mistaken for stern disapproval. It was not. Increased the discretion of his guard detail. Do not stop him, Your Majesty. A prince who never leaves his palace makes a poor ruler, and an even poorer judge of the people he will one day govern. The emperor allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Let him buy his pastries. Just make certain no one follows him closely enough to spoil the illusion that he is getting away with something. By the time Issei turned 12, he had developed a reputation among the lower districts of Pandemonium as a polite, oddly generous boy who tipped too much and asked too many questions, and no reputation whatsoever among the noble houses, who remained largely unaware that the palace's mysterious heir spent as much time in market stalls as he did in study halls. That would not last. Nothing in the underworld stayed quiet forever, and the noble houses, for all their infighting, were not blind. But for a few more years, at least, Issei Vashel was allowed to simply be a boy, learning the shape of the world he would one day be asked to hold together, one pastry and one broken chess rule at a time. The invitation arrived on a morning bright enough that Issei nearly missed the significance of the seal pressed into the wax, too busy arguing with Grafia over whether he was allowed a second pastry before his lessons began. The Gremory household, she said, turning the letter over in her hands with an expression Issei had learned, over 15 years, to read as cautious interest rather than genuine approval. They have requested your presence at a gathering to introduce their heir to the households of standing. I am a household of standing now? You are the Emperor's son. You have been a household of standing since the day he named you, whether the other clans wish to acknowledge it or not. She set the letter down and studied him with the particular scrutiny she reserved for moments she considered important, which was, in fairness, most moments. This is the first time one of the great houses has extended a direct invitation. It is not nothing. Issei turned the possibility over the way his father had taught him to turn over any new piece of information, looking for the angles nobody had bothered to point out to him directly. They want to see what I am. Whether I am worth allying with, or worth dismissing. Very likely both, depending on the guest. And if I go, then you go as your father's son, and you conduct yourself as such. No pastries stolen from the buffet table before the other guests have eaten. No wandering off to interrogate the kitchen staff about their recipes, however tempting that might be. Grafia's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she allowed herself in the mornings. And you keep your composure, whatever provocation you are offered. There will be provocation, Issei. Some of these families have waited a long time to see how the Emperor's mysterious heir behaves under pressure. He went, dressed in clothing that felt entirely too formal and carrying himself with a composure that had taken years of Grafia's patient, exacting instruction to build. The Gremory estate was a sprawling, elegant thing, all high windows and warm light, and Issei found himself more curious about the architecture than intimidated by the gathered nobility, a fact that would have surprised anyone expecting a nervous, out-of-place orphan playing at royalty. He met Rias Gremory first, a girl a year or two younger than himself with sharp red hair and an even sharper way of studying people, as though she were cataloging exactly how much attention they deserved and adjusting her manner accordingly. "You are the Emperor's son," she said, without preamble, once the required introductions had been made and the adults had drifted off toward their own conversations. "The one nobody knows anything about. I am told that is the general impression, yes? Is it true you have no clan magic at all? That whatever you carry, nobody can identify it?" Issei considered several answers, weighed the political cost of each against the value of simply being honest with a girl who did not seem inclined toward flattery in either direction, and settled on the truth, or at least the portion of it that was his to share. "I do not know what I carry. Not fully. My father has chosen not to tell me yet, and I have decided to trust that he has good reasons, even when I would rather just be told." Something in that answer seemed to catch her off guard, because for a moment the careful assessment in her eyes gave way to something more genuinely curious. "That is either very wise or very foolish. I have not decided which. My father tells me those are frequently the same thing, viewed from different distances." Rias laughed, a short, surprised sound, and for the rest of the evening, whether by her design or simple happenstance, Issei found himself talking with her more than with anyone else in the room, trading observations about the assembled guests with the easy, slightly conspiratorial humor of two children who had both grown up being watched more closely than either particularly enjoyed. Not every guest was so easily won over. "An heir with no bloodline," said a young man from the Bale family, later in the evening, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of nobles standing nearby, though not quite loud enough to be an open insult. "It is a strange thing, is it not, that the oldest throne in the Underworld has chosen a foundling to inherit it? One wonders what the Emperor was thinking." Issei felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that he had learned, over years of careful tutoring, to recognize and manage rather than act on. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the sharp retort that came easily to mind. He simply turned, met the young man's gaze directly, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make clear he had heard every word. "My father has spent longer thinking about the future of this realm than either of us has been alive," he said, evenly. "I have found it a reasonable policy to trust his judgment on matters he has considered for 3 centuries longer than I have had the chance to consider anything at all. Perhaps, in time, you will find the patience for the same courtesy." It was not a challenge. It was not quite a rebuke. But something in the calm certainty of it landed harder than an angry response ever could have, and the young Bale noble found himself with considerably less to say for the remainder of the evening. Rias, watching the exchange from a few steps away, did not bother to hide her small, approving smile. Word of the gathering reached the palace before Issei himself did, as such things generally do, and he found his father waiting for him in the study that evening with an expression that suggested he had already heard a detailed account from at least 2 independent sources. "I am told you handled Lord Bale's grandson with admirable restraint. Grafia told you." "Grafia tells me everything. It is rather the point of having her manage the household." Bahram gestured to the chair across from his own, and Issei settled into it with the particular tiredness of someone who had spent an entire evening performing a version of himself for an audience that had not yet decided whether to like him. "You could have said a great deal more than you did." "Most would have. I did not think it would help." "No. It would not have." The Emperor studied his son for a long moment, something thoughtful and quietly proud settling behind his ancient eyes. "You are beginning to understand something it took me the better part of a century to learn properly. Restraint is not weakness, Issei. It is the clearest evidence of strength available to anyone watching closely enough to recognize it. Anyone can raise their voice. Very few can hold their composure while an insult sits directly in front of them and choose, deliberately, not to take the bait. It did not feel like strength. It felt like standing very still and hoping I did not say something I would regret. That," Bahram said, with the faintest trace of a smile, "is precisely what strength feels like, most of the time. Anyone who tells you otherwise has not actually had to practice it." They sat together a while longer, the fire burning low, and Issei found himself turning the evening over in his mind the way his father had taught him to turn over anything important. He thought about Rias Gremory's sharp, assessing eyes and her surprised laugh. He thought about the careful weight of Lord Bale's grandson's insult, and the strange, settled calm he had found instead of anger. He thought, most of all, about the quiet, persistent question that had followed him his entire life and had, for the first time that evening, been spoken aloud by someone outside the palace walls. What are you really? He did not have an answer yet. But for the first time, he found himself genuinely curious to learn it, rather than simply content to let the question wait. The attack came on an evening that had, until then, been entirely unremarkable. Issei was 16, home from an afternoon spent arguing pleasantly with Rias Gremory over the correct way to structure a peerage strategy either of them had any practical use for yet, when the wards around the eastern perimeter of the palace grounds failed all at once, without warning, in a way that Grafia would later describe as deliberate rather than accidental. Old wards, layered by centuries of careful maintenance, did not simply fail. They were unmade precisely, by someone who understood exactly how they had been built. He heard the alarm before he understood what it meant, a deep, resonant tone that he had only ever heard described in lessons and never once in practice. And by the time he made it to the corridor outside his rooms, palace guards were already moving past him in formation, faces set with the particular grim urgency of people who had trained for exactly this scenario and never truly expected to need it. Stay in your rooms, one of them called back to him, not unkindly, but with no room for argument in it either. He did not stay in his rooms. He found Grafia in the east wing, standing at the center of a corridor that had, moments before, apparently held an intruder, judging by the scorched marks along the walls and the tension radiating off every guard within sight. She turned the moment she sensed him approaching, and whatever calm authority she usually wore had been replaced by something sharper, more urgent. You should not be here. What is happening? An incursion. Old Satan loyalists, we believe, the remnants who never accepted the current government, and have spent years waiting for a moment of weakness to exploit. She caught his arm, pulling him back a step as a fresh wave of magic crackled somewhere further down the corridor. They are not here for the palace treasury, Issei. They are here for you. The rest of the evening unfolded in fragments that Issei would spend a long time afterward trying to piece back together in the correct order. He remembered being moved through the palace's inner corridors, guards forming a protective ring around him that felt, despite its purpose, uncomfortably like being herded. He remembered the sound of fighting growing closer rather than further away, which meant, however carefully no one wanted to say it aloud, that the defense was not holding as well as anyone had hoped. He remembered, most clearly, the moment 3 intruders broke through the guard formation directly ahead of him, robed and masked in the manner of the old Satan faction's most fanatical remnants, and the sudden, absolute certainty that there was no time left to be herded anywhere safe. If the old bloodlines will not rule this realm, the lead intruder said, voice distorted by whatever spell masked his features, then no foundling with a stolen crown will either. The attack that followed happened too quickly for conscious thought. A burst of raw destructive magic aimed directly at him with no warning and no mercy behind it, and Issei had exactly enough time to understand, with total clarity, that he was not going to be fast enough to move out of its path. Something in his chest answered instead. It was not a decision. It was not a spell he had learned or a technique any tutor had drilled into him. It was simply there, all at once, a golden light erupting from somewhere beneath his skin and coalescing, faster than thought, into a gauntlet of red and gold scales that closed around his forearm and threw itself between him and the incoming spell with a will that felt, in that first bewildering instant, entirely separate from his own. The magic shattered against it and dissipated into harmless sparks. Boost! The voice that spoke was not his own, deep and resonant and utterly calm in the way of something ancient enough to have long since stopped being frightened of anything, and Issei staggered back a step, staring at the gauntlet on his arm with an expression that, had anyone been watching closely enough to notice past the chaos, would have looked a great deal like recognition finally arriving after a long wait. The fight that followed lasted less than a minute, though it felt considerably longer. The boosted gear, sealed and dormant his entire life, had apparently decided that the moment for patience had ended, and the surge of power that answered Issei's instinctive defense was more than enough to overwhelm 3 intruders who had not planned for their target to suddenly develop a weapon powerful enough to end wars. By the time the palace guard finally caught up, the 3 attackers lay unconscious at his feet, and Issei stood in the middle of the wreckage with the gauntlet of scales still humming faintly against his skin, breathing hard, staring at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else entirely. His father found him there. Bahram Vashel crossed the ruined corridor without hurry, the same unhurried calm he brought to every crisis the Underworld had ever handed him, and stopped in front of his son with an expression that held relief and something more complicated underneath it in equal measure. "You are unharmed." "I am." Issei looked down at the gauntlet again, and it faded slowly back into whatever quiet place it had slept for 16 years, leaving only a faint warmth behind. "Father, what is this? What have I been carrying?" The Emperor was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was an old, careful weariness in his voice that Issei had rarely heard from him. "The boosted gear. One of the 2 Longinus-class sacred gears bound to the heavenly dragons, the oldest and most powerful weapons this world has ever produced outside the hands of gods. I have known what you carried since the day Grafia found you. I chose not to tell you until you were old enough to understand what it meant, and old enough, I hoped, to be strong enough to protect yourself before anyone learned to use that knowledge against you. You could have told me. I could have trained for it. You could have. And you would have spent every day of your childhood measuring yourself against a power you had not yet grown into, rather than simply growing." Bahram reached out and rested a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, an uncharacteristic gesture from a man who rarely showed affection so plainly, especially not in front of the guards still clearing the corridor around them. "I made a choice, Issei, and I will not pretend it carried no cost. But you stood in front of an assassin's strike tonight, and the gear answered you the moment you needed it, not before, not in some controlled exercise designed to make you comfortable with its power. It answered because you are ready, not because you were told you should be." Issei absorbed that in silence, turning the strange golden warmth of the last few minutes over in his mind alongside everything else the evening had appended. Somewhere down the corridor, a voice, low and rumbling and entirely too pleased with itself, echoed faintly from the depths of his own thoughts. "Well, that was more excitement than I expected on my first evening awake in 16 years. I am Drake. It appears we have a great deal to discuss, partner." "There is a dragon in my head," Issei said, with the particular flat disbelief of someone who had reached the absolute limit of surprises he could reasonably process in one evening. "There is," his father agreed, and for the first time since the alarm had sounded, something like genuine amusement crossed his ancient face. "I did warn you it would not be an ordinary inheritance. The old Satan loyalists responsible for the attack would, in the days that followed, be tracked to a splinter faction that had been quietly rebuilding influence in the shadows of the Underworld for longer than anyone in the current government had realized, a discovery that shook the council considerably more than the attack itself had. But that night, in the wreckage of the East Corridor, none of that mattered yet to Issei. What mattered was the golden light still humming faintly beneath his skin, the ancient voice settling into the back of his mind like an old friend finally introduced, and his father's steady hand on his shoulder, holding him upright through the last of the adrenaline the way he had held him, 16 years ago, in a garden full of black roses, before either of them had known what the future intended to make of him. The council chamber had not summoned the Emperor's heir to testify in over a century, and the novelty of it showed in the way the assembled Satans and noble representatives leaned forward in their seats as Issei was announced, some with open curiosity, others with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had already decided what they wanted to believe and were simply waiting for an excuse to say it aloud. He walked in wearing formal dress that still felt slightly foreign against his shoulders and took the seat offered to him with a composure that Grafia, watching from the gallery, noted with quiet approval. Whatever nerves he carried, he had learned, at last, not to let them show. "The realm has questions," Sirzex Lucifer said, opening the proceedings with the easy, measured tone of a man who had chaired 100 difficult meetings and made all of them look effortless. "An attack on the Imperial Palace, an heir revealed to carry one of the 2 Longinus sacred gears bound to the heavenly dragons, and old Satan loyalists apparently active enough to mount a coordinated strike against the second most secure location in the Underworld. I think it fair to say the Council would appreciate clarity. I understand the concern, Issei said, and if his voice shook at all in that first sentence, it steadied quickly after. I would ask, first, that the Council understands something my father has spent his reign trying to teach me. Power like the one I carry is not a weapon to be paraded. It is a responsibility, and one I intend to treat with considerably more caution than the faction who attacked my home seems to believe I will. Seraphal Leviathan, who had spent the better part of 16 years openly skeptical of the entire arrangement, studied him with narrowed eyes. Pretty words. But the realm has heard pretty words from ambitious young devils before, and watched them curdle into something else entirely once real power arrived in their hands. What makes you different? It was, Issei recognized, exactly the question he had been dreading and exactly the one he needed to answer well. I cannot prove to this council today what I will or will not become in 10 years, or 100, he said carefully. No one can prove that about themselves, however much they might wish to. What I can tell you is what I have already chosen, in the moments that mattered most. When I was attacked in my own home, I did not seek out the faction responsible to demand vengeance. I asked my father to let the council's investigators handle it properly, through the same channels that would apply to any other crime committed against any other citizen of this realm, because the alternative, an emperor's son settling his own grievances outside the law, is precisely the kind of precedent that turns a strong ruler into a dangerous one. A murmur passed through the chamber, and Issei pressed on before it could settle into a shape he could not control. I did not ask for this gear. I did not ask to be found in the wreckage of a battlefield with no name and no lineage, and I did not ask my father to make me his heir instead of leaving that burden to someone born into it more naturally. But I have been given both, and I intend to spend whatever years I have proving that they were not given carelessly. Not to this council. To the people of this realm, who will live or suffer under whatever choices I eventually make. Ajuka Beelzebub, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire proceeding, finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the chamber's careful acoustics. You speak of the people rather than the council. That is not the answer most heirs give when asked to justify themselves to this body. Most heirs were raised to see the council as the audience that matters, Issei said. My father raised me to remember that the council exists to serve the realm, not the reverse, and that an heir who forgets that distinction eventually becomes a ruler the realm has to survive rather than one it can trust. I would rather be measured against that standard than against how well I flatter the room. It was not, by any measure, a flawless performance. His voice caught once on the mention of his uncertain lineage, and Fabium Asmodeus noted afterward, with characteristic bluntness, that the boy had clearly rehearsed portions of his answer rather than speaking entirely from instinct. But something in the substance of it, the deliberate refusal to grasp for either sympathy or authority he had not yet earned, landed with a weight that a more polished answer might have lacked. Serzex, watching his sister's future-in-laws exchange glances across the chamber, allowed himself a small, private smile. Rias had mentioned this boy more than once over the past year, always with a certain careful interest she rarely extended to anyone else her age, and watching him now, holding his ground against a room of devils who had collectively survived more political maneuvering than most nations produced in a millennium, he found himself understanding why. The council's formal response, delivered a week later through the appropriate channels, was measured and non-committal in the way of documents drafted by committees determined to commit to nothing they might later regret. But the practical effect was clear enough to anyone paying attention. The investigation into the old Satan loyalists would proceed through official channels, with full council backing. The imperial palace's security would be reinforced at the realm's expense rather than the emperor's alone, a small but meaningful acknowledgement that the throne of Pandemonium was, once again, being treated as a pillar of the current government rather than a relic tolerated out of habit. And Issei himself, whatever reservations individual council members continued to harbor, was, for the first time, referred to in official correspondence not merely as the Emperor's ward, but as Crown Prince Issei Vashel, heir to the imperial throne. You did well, Bahram told him that evening, in the same study where so many of their most important conversations had taken place over the years, a bottle of something old and carefully rationed opened between them, one glass poured for each of them for the first time in Issei's life. Better than well. I have sat through 3 centuries of council sessions, Issei, and I do not say lightly that few of them have handled that room as gracefully as you did today. I was terrified the entire time. Everyone who has ever done anything worth doing in that chamber was terrified the entire time. The ones who were not terrified were the ones who did not understand the stakes. The Emperor studied his son for a long moment, something quietly, deeply proud settling into the lines of his ancient face. You told them the council exists to serve the realm rather than the reverse. Do you know how long it has been since anyone in that chamber heard a member of the ruling class say such a thing and actually mean it? I meant it because you taught me to mean it. I taught you the words. You are the one who chose to believe them, and to say them aloud to a room full of devils who could have made your life considerably harder for the effort. Bahram raised his glass slightly, a small, private toast between father and son. The Underworld will spend the next several years deciding whether to trust you, Issei. Today, I think, you gave them their first genuine reason to start. Outside the study window, the black roses of the north garden had begun, faintly, to bloom, though the season for it was not quite right, as if the palace itself had noticed something shifting in the air and decided, quietly, to celebrate it in the only language it knew how to speak. Rias found him in the palace's north garden 3 weeks after the council session, unannounced and slightly out of breath, having apparently talked her way past the outer guards with a combination of family name and sheer determination that Issei privately suspected the guards had simply found easier to allow than to argue with. You are difficult to visit, she said, by way of greeting, settling onto the stone bench beside him without waiting for an invitation. Do you know how much paperwork it takes to arrange a visit to the Crown Prince these days? I did not ask for the paperwork. No, but you have it anyway. That is rather the point of what happened at the council session. You are not simply the Emperor's mysterious ward anymore. She studied him with the same sharp, assessing look she had given him the first time they met, years ago now, though something in it had softened considerably since then. Congratulations. Or condolences. I have not entirely decided which is more accurate. Both, I think. My father tells me that is often the case with things worth having. She smiled at that, and for a while they simply sat together in the quiet of the garden, watching the black roses sway faintly in a breeze that smelled of the coming season's change, either of them feeling any particular urgency to fill the silence with conversation. It was, Issei had come to realize over the past several months, one of the things he valued most about her company. She did not perform for him the way so many of the noble scions had learned to perform for anyone with a title worth cultivating. She simply said what she thought, argued when she disagreed, and left the space between them comfortable rather than strategic. The old loyalists, she said eventually, more seriously. Sirzek's mentioned the investigation is turning up more than anyone expected. A wider network than a single splinter faction acting alone. I know. Issei's expression sobered, the easy warmth of the afternoon giving way to something more careful. My father has not told me everything yet. But I have learned enough, watching him these past weeks, to recognize when something is weighing on him more heavily than he wants to admit. Are you frightened? He considered the question honestly, rather than reaching for whatever answer might have sounded more appropriately princely. A little. Less of the loyalists themselves than of what it might mean if the network runs as deep as everyone fears. My father has held this realm steady for 3 centuries by making sure the peace held even when the people responsible for it disagreed about almost everything else. If there is a faction patient enough and organized enough to have waited this long for a chance to unravel that, then the next several years are going to test all of us in ways none of my tutors ever quite prepared me for. You will not be facing it alone. It was said simply, without any of the careful political calculation that so often accompanied conversations between the Underworld's ruling houses. And Issei found himself looking at her with something that was not quite surprise but was, at the very least, genuine gratitude. Thank you? Do not thank me yet. I intend to hold you to a great many arguments about strategy before this is over, and I have already told you my thoughts on your peerage theories more than once. But she was smiling as she said it, and the warmth in her voice made the teasing land considerably softer than the words alone might have suggested. Inside the palace, in the same study where 3 centuries of the underworld's quiet governance had been conducted one careful decision at a time, Bahram Vashal sat with a report open in front of him that he had not yet shown to his son, tracing the edges of a sigil his investigators had recovered from the wreckage of the failed attack, a sigil that matched no known faction currently active in the underworld, and matched, disturbingly, fragments of a much older conflict that the realm had spent the better part of a century trying to forget. Grafia entered without announcement, as she alone among the household staff was permitted to do, and studied the report over his shoulder with the same careful attention she gave to everything that threatened the household she had spent 16 years helping to build. "You have not told him?" "Not yet." The Emperor set the report down and rubbed at his eyes, an uncharacteristic gesture of weariness that he rarely allowed even Grafia to witness. "He handled the council chamber better than I dared hope. He is growing into exactly the kind of ruler this realm will need in the years ahead. But this," he tapped the sigil, "this is older and more patient than a single splinter faction seeking petty revenge for a war they lost. If what I suspect is true, we are not looking at the last gasp of a defeated loyalist movement. We are looking at the opening move of something considerably larger, and I do not yet know how much time we have before it forces our hand." "Then we prepare him." "We prepare him," Bahram agreed quietly, watching through the study window as his son sat in the garden below, laughing at something Rias Gremory had said. 16 years of careful, deliberate raising visible in the easy confidence of a boy who had once been a nameless infant pulled from a battlefield and was, slowly, becoming something the underworld had not seen in centuries. "But carefully, Grafia. Let him have this season a little longer. The storms ahead will arrive soon enough on their own, and I would rather he meet them as a young man who was given every chance to grow strong first, than as a frightened boy rushed into a war before he was ready to carry it." Outside, unaware of the quiet weight settling over the study above him, Issei leaned back against the garden bench and watched the black roses catch the last of the afternoon light, entirely certain, in that unguarded moment, that whatever the future intended to demand of him, he would face it exactly the way his father had taught him to face everything else. Not alone, and not unprepared, but one careful, deliberate choice at a time. The sigil recovered from the ruins of the east corridor sat on the council table like something that had chosen, deliberately, to be difficult to look at directly, its lines curling in patterns that seemed to shift faintly whenever no one was watching them closely enough. "We have identified it," Ajuka Beelzebub said, without any of his usual restraint, which alone told Issei how seriously he ought to take what came next. "Or rather, we have identified what it is not. It does not belong to any active faction currently operating in the underworld. It predates the Satan houses entirely. My best analysis places its origin somewhere in the final years of the old primordial devil courts, before the first war that created the system we live under now." Bahram Vashal studied the sigil with an expression that gave away nothing, which was, in itself, unusual enough that Grafia glanced at him twice during the presentation. The Umbra Concord. The name landed in the council chamber with a weight that Issei did not fully understand, though he understood enough, from the way even Surzex went briefly still, to recognize that it mattered a great deal. "You believe them still active," Seraphal Leviathan said, carefully, "after 4 centuries. I believe them extinguished, along with every primordial court that refused to accept the reforms that created the current Satan system," the Emperor said. "It appears I was wrong. Or, more precisely, it appears they were patient enough to let the realm believe they were wrong on their behalf, while they rebuilt in whatever shadow they found deepest." Issei, seated at his father's side in a chair that had, over the past several months, stopped feeling quite so much like a borrowed formality, found himself turning the name over silently, cataloguing it alongside everything else his tutors had ever taught him about the founding of the current government, none of which had ever mentioned an organization by that particular name. "What did they want?" he asked, when the discussion paused long enough to permit it. "Before the reforms, I mean. What made them refuse to accept the current system in the first place?" "Purity," Bahram said simply. "The old courts believed devil society should remain stratified precisely along bloodlines that predated even the current noble houses, ranked by proximity to the original primordial families rather than by merit, by service, or by any of the structures the current government has spent centuries building to replace that hierarchy. An heir with no lineage at all, raised to inherit the oldest throne in the realm, would represent, to a faction like that, an offense considerably deeper than a simple political inconvenience. The implication settled over the chamber slowly, and Issei felt it settle over himself in turn, cold and clear. The attack on the palace had not been a desperate, opportunistic strike by a dying faction grasping for relevance. It had been the opening move of an organization that considered his very existence, the fact of a nameless foundling sitting where 3 centuries of tradition said only pure blood belonged, to be a wound requiring correction. Then they will not stop with one attempt, he said. No, his father agreed quietly. They will not. The council's response, in the days that followed, split along familiar lines. Some among the noble houses, quietly and never quite openly, seemed to find a certain grim satisfaction in the notion that the emperor's unconventional heir had drawn the attention of a faction obsessed with bloodline purity, as though the universe itself had confirmed a suspicion they had never quite voiced aloud. Others, Surzek's chief among them, treated the revelation as exactly what it was, a genuine and growing threat to the stability the current government had spent 3 centuries building, and pressed for increased cooperation between the imperial household and the Satan Council's own intelligence networks. We cannot fight this quietly forever, Surzek told Bahram, in a private meeting Issei was permitted to attend for the first time, a mark of trust that did not escape him. If the Umbra Concord has spent 4 centuries rebuilding, they will not be dismantled by a single investigation, however thorough. This will require the noble houses, the council, and the imperial throne working from the same understanding, for as long as it takes. You are asking me to open my son's training and his security to your intelligence networks, Bahram said. That is not a small request. It is not. But I am also offering the reverse, and I do not offer that lightly. Surzek's easy, diplomatic warmth cooled into something more serious, more genuinely urgent than Issei had yet seen from him. The Gremory house has resources this threat will require. So does every major noble family with a stake in the current government's survival. If they attack the imperial palace once, believing your son a weakness they could exploit, they will learn very quickly how wrong that assumption was, provided we do not waste the years ahead relearning old suspicions instead of building something stronger. Bahram was quiet for a long moment, weighing the offer the way he weighed everything, against 3 centuries of precedent that had never quite required this particular kind of trust before. When he finally spoke, it was to Issei rather than to Surzek. What do you think? The question caught him slightly off guard, not because his father had never asked his opinion before, but because this was the first time it had been asked in a room where the answer would shape policy rather than simply satisfy a father's curiosity about his son's growing mind. I think, Issei said carefully, that the Concord is counting on us to remain divided. They attacked believing an heir with no bloodline would be a weakness the noble houses would rather exploit than defend. If we prove them wrong, if the imperial throne and the Satan houses stand together against them from the beginning rather than circling each other first, then we have already taken away the one advantage they were counting on. Surzek's expression shifted, something like genuine respect settling into it. Bahram, for his part, allowed himself the smallest of satisfied smiles. Then we accept the offer, the emperor said, on the condition that the arrangement runs both directions. My son will not simply be protected by the noble houses. He will be trained alongside them, tested by the same standards, and permitted to prove himself by the same measure any other heir would be required to meet. If the Concord's entire argument rests on the idea that bloodline determines worth, I would very much like the opportunity to demonstrate, publicly and repeatedly, exactly how wrong that argument is. It was, Issei would understand only much later, the moment his father stopped simply protecting him from the realm's judgment and began, deliberately, positioning him to answer it. That evening, in the quiet of his own rooms, Drake's voice rumbled up from the depths of his thoughts with the particular dry amusement the ancient dragon reserved for moments he found genuinely interesting. Your father just volunteered you for a considerably harder road than the one you were on yesterday, partner. I noticed. Good. It is about time someone did. Sleeping dragons and sealed gears only stay patient for so long, And I did not wait 16 years to watch you spend the next 16 hiding behind a throne instead of learning what you are actually capable of. Issei looked down at his own hand, remembering the golden light that had answered him without instruction the night of the attack, and felt, for the first time since the council chamber's grim revelations, something that was not quite fear settle into its place instead. Then I suppose we had better get started. The training ground beneath the palace had not been used in earnest for over a century, and it showed, in the faint layer of dust that clung to equipment built for devils who had long since died or retired, in the way the reinforced walls still bore the pale scars of spells cast by generals whose names now belonged only to history texts. Bahram had it restored within a week of the council's agreement, and by the time the noble houses sent their first instructors to begin formal work with the emperor's heir, the chamber looked, Issei thought, considerably more like a battlefield waiting to happen than a training room. His first instructor arrived from the Citri household, a stern, precise woman named Rhea who had, according to Graphia's careful briefing, once served as one of the most decorated combat tacticians in the last major devil conflict before the current peace settled into place. She studied Issei for a long moment upon arrival, circling him once with the clinical detachment of someone assessing raw material rather than meeting a prince. You have a Longinus sealed for 16 years and awakened by pure instinct under battlefield stress, she said, without preamble. That tells me two things. First, that whatever waits inside you is powerful enough to answer without training, which is rare and valuable. Second, that you have absolutely no idea how to summon it, control it, or use it deliberately, which is considerably more dangerous than not having it at all. That seems like a fair assessment. It is the only kind I offer. She gestured toward the center of the training ground. Summon it. Now, deliberately, without waiting for someone to try to kill you first. It took him considerably longer than he expected, standing in the center of the chamber with his eyes closed, reaching for the golden warmth he remembered from the night of the attack and finding, at first, nothing but silence where the instinctive fire had been. Drake's voice, when it finally answered, carried a patience that suggested this particular struggle was neither unexpected nor especially concerning. It came easily when your life depended on it, partner. Now you are asking it to come simply because you wish it to, and that is a very different kind of trust to build. Power is not stubborn. It is honest. It answers fear instantly because fear leaves no room for doubt. Deliberate calling requires you to want something just as clearly, without the excuse of an emergency to sharpen your focus for you. Then help me want it clearly. You already do. You simply have not learned to trust that wanting, yet, without a crisis standing behind it. He tried again, and this time, rather than reaching for the memory of fear, he reached instead for the memory of his father's hand on his shoulder in the wreckage of the East Corridor, for the quiet, steady certainty in Bahram's voice when he had said he was ready. The gauntlet answered slower than it had that night, but it answered, scales of red and gold closing around his forearm with a low, resonant hum that felt, this time, entirely deliberate rather than instinctive. Rhea's stern expression did not soften exactly, but something in it shifted toward approval. Better. Now we begin the actual work. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Issei found, somewhat to his own surprise, deeply satisfying. Mornings belonged to Rhea's exacting combat drills, hours spent learning to summon and dismiss the boosted gear with increasing speed and precision, to channel Drake's boost ability in controlled bursts rather than the wild, instinctive surge that had overwhelmed his attackers, to understand, gradually, the difference between raw power and the discipline required to wield it without losing himself inside it. Afternoons belonged to strategy, tactics instructors from 3 different noble houses cycling through to test him against increasingly complex scenarios, forcing him to think not merely as a soldier defending himself but as a commander responsible for others. Evenings, more often than not, belonged to Rias. She had taken, over the past several months, to visiting the palace with a regularity that Grafia noted with an expression somewhere between approval and amusement, and Issei found himself looking forward to those visits with a warmth he did not examine too closely, too occupied with the day's exhaustion to interrogate exactly what it meant. You look terrible, she informed him, cheerfully, finding him collapsed on a garden bench after a particularly grueling session with Rhea, still faintly steaming from a training spell that had gotten closer to landing than he would have liked to admit. "Thank you? I value your honesty. Someone has to keep you humble. The council seems entirely too impressed with you lately, and I refuse to let that go to your head while I still remember you losing a chess match by accidentally moving your bishop diagonally through your own pawns. That was one time. Years ago. It was formative." She settled beside him on the bench, studying his tired, faintly bruised expression with something more serious underneath the teasing. "How is the training, really?" He considered the question honestly, the way he had learned, slowly, to answer her honestly rather than performing whatever composure the moment seemed to demand. "Difficult. Not the fighting, exactly, though that is difficult enough on its own. It is the part where I am supposed to learn to want power deliberately, without a crisis forcing my hand, and trust that the wanting is enough on its own. I did not expect that to be the hardest part, but it is. That does not surprise me." "Why not?" "Because you have spent your entire life being told, gently but constantly, that you arrived in this world without anything you were owed, no bloodline, no birthright, nothing except what your father chose to give you freely." Rias's expression softened in a way she rarely allowed in front of anyone outside her closest circle. "Wanting something for yourself, deliberately and without apology, is a different kind of courage than surviving an attack you did not choose. I imagine it is harder precisely because no one can teach you that particular lesson the way Rhea teaches combat drills. You simply have to decide, over and over, that you are allowed to want things." He looked at her for a long moment, struck, not for the first time, by how easily she saw past whatever composure he tried to maintain in front of the rest of the realm. "You should consider a career advising the council. You would put half their tacticians out of work." "I have considered it. I have decided I would rather build my own peerage and prove I do not need my brother's shadow to matter in this realm, which, I am told, is a very similar ambition to the one you are currently wrestling with." She smiled, warm and a little wry. "Perhaps that is why I keep finding excuses to visit. Misery loves company, and ambition apparently loves it even more." Drake, silent through most of the exchange, offered a low, rumbling observation from the depths of Issei's thoughts, dry with an amusement centuries in the making. "She is not wrong, partner. And for what it is worth, I have existed a very long time, watched a great many hosts struggle with a great many burdens. Watching you learn to want something simply because you have decided you deserve it, rather than because the world forced your hand, is more encouraging than you probably realize." Issei did not answer the dragon aloud, not with Rias sitting beside him in the fading evening light, but he let the thought settle anyway, turning it over the way his father had taught him to turn over anything worth keeping. He was, slowly and deliberately, learning to want things. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt less like a burden than like the beginning of something worth building. The invitation to the Gremory, delivered through channels formal enough that even Grafia treated it with unusual care, arrived on a morning when Issei had least expected to be thinking about diplomacy at all, still sore from a training session that had left him with a healthy respect for exactly how hard Rhea could hit when she felt he was getting complacent. "The fallen angel governor has requested a formal audience with the imperial heir," Bahram said, reading the letter over breakfast with an expression that suggested he found the timing significant rather than coincidental. "Azazel, specifically. Which is, in itself, unusual. He rarely extends personal invitations to anyone outside his own faction's inner circles." "Do you trust him?" "I trust that Azazel is considerably more interested in interesting problems than in old grudges between factions, which makes him more predictable than most leaders in this realm, provided you understand what he actually values." The Emperor set the letter down, considering his son with the careful weighing look that usually preceded a decision about how much responsibility to hand over next. "The Umber Concord's reach may extend beyond our own borders. If they are old enough to predate the current Satan system, they may well have roots that touch the fallen angels and the angels both, however unwelcome that thought might be to any of the three factions individually. Azazel has resources for gathering information that even our own intelligence networks cannot match. An alliance, even an informal one, would be valuable. You want me to go. I want you to consider it, and to understand fully what you would be agreeing to before you decide." Bahram's expression grew more serious. This would not be a courtesy visit among devils who already, however grudgingly, accept your place in this realm. You would be representing the imperial throne to a faction with centuries of complicated history with our own, in the middle of a crisis that has already tried to kill you once. Azazel will test you, Issei, in ways considerably less polite than anything the council chamber offered. Issei thought of the golden warmth of the boosted gear settling around his forearm, of Rhea's exacting drills, of Rias's steady, unglamorous encouragement in the garden each evening, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the prospect did not frighten him the way it might have a year earlier. Then I should go prepared to be tested. The journey to Gregory territory took the better part of a day, and Issei spent most of it reviewing everything his tutors had ever taught him about the fallen angel faction's history, its uneasy peace with the devils and angels both, and the particular reputation of the governor he was about to meet, a reputation that seemed to consist, in roughly equal parts, of genuine brilliance and a fondness for chaos that made even seasoned diplomats visibly nervous. Azazel received him not in a formal audience chamber, as protocol might have suggested, but in a sprawling laboratory cluttered with half-finished magical devices, ancient texts stacked in towers that defied any organizational logic Issei could discern, and the faint, persistent smell of something that had recently, and probably deliberately, been set on fire. The Emperor's mysterious heir, Azazel said, not looking up immediately from whatever intricate mechanism he was adjusting with a small, delicate tool. I confess I expected you sooner. Bahram Vashel does not usually take this long to accept an obviously advantageous alliance. My father wanted to be certain I understood what I was agreeing to before he sent me. Wise. Most rulers simply send their heirs and hope for the best. Azazel finally set down his tool and turned to study Issei directly, sharp golden eyes assessing him with an intensity that felt considerably more clinical than hostile. You carry the boosted gear. Sealed for 16 years, awakened under attack, currently being trained by one of the Citri House's better tacticians, if my information is current, which it generally is. Your information is very current. I make a point of staying informed. It is considerably more useful than most of the alternatives. Azazel gestured toward a cluttered table, inviting Issei to sit amid the chaos with a casualness that suggested formal furniture arrangements bored him considerably. Let us skip the portion of this conversation where we pretend not to already understand why you are here. The Umber Concord is not merely a devil problem, Prince Issei. Their ideology of bloodline purity predates the current three-faction peace entirely, and I have reason to believe their reach extends further than your father's investigators have yet uncovered. You know something. I know a great many things. Whether I choose to share them depends considerably on whether I believe the alliance being offered is genuine, rather than simply a convenient device your father intends to discard once the immediate crisis passes. Azazel's expression sharpened, testing rather than hostile. Convince me, Prince Issei. Not with the polished answers I imagine the council chamber has already trained into you. Tell me, honestly, why I should trust an heir with no lineage, raised by a monarch who has spent 3 centuries carefully avoiding entanglement with my faction, to actually mean whatever partnership he proposes. Issei considered the question for a long moment, aware that whatever answer he gave would likely determine considerably more than the fate of a single meeting. Because I do not have the luxury of pretending this problem belongs only to my own faction, he said finally. I was found on a battlefield with no name, and no lineage, and the only reason I have anything at all, a throne, a father, a purpose, is because someone chose to extend trust to me before I had earned it in any way the old order would have recognized. I understand, better than most heirs raised entirely within their own bloodlines, what it costs to be judged only by the circumstances of your birth rather than by what you actually choose to do. If the Concord succeeds in dragging this realm back toward that kind of thinking, it will not stop conveniently at the devil faction's borders. It will threaten every peace built on the idea that a person's worth is not predetermined by their blood. That is not merely my father's problem to solve. It is mine, and if your faction shares any stake in the world that peace has built, it is yours as well. Azazel was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from clinical assessment into something more genuinely interested. That, he said eventually, is the first honest answer I have received from Imperial Pandemonium in longer than I care to admit. He rose, crossing to one of his cluttered shelves and retrieving a sealed file that had clearly been prepared well before Issei's arrival. Evidence, Issei realized, that the test had never truly been in doubt, only the manner of passing it. The Gremory have intercepted fragments of Concord communication over the past 2 years, dismissed at the time as unrelated noise. I did not connect them to anything significant until your father's investigation went public. I believe, now, that I was wrong to dismiss them so easily. He handed the file across, and Issei accepted it with the careful weight of someone recognizing, in real time, that a genuine alliance had just been forged, not through polished diplomacy alone, but through an honesty he had chosen, deliberately, over the safer, more practiced answer. Take that back to your father, Azazel said. And Prince Issei. The next time the Concord moves against you, and they will move again, I suspect sooner than either of us would prefer, know that the Gremory will not simply watch from a comfortable distance while a boy who understands exactly what he is fighting for tries to hold the line alone. The file Azazel provided took the combined efforts of Ajuka's analysts and the Imperial household's own investigators the better part of a month to properly decode, and what it revealed, once the fragments finally resolved into something legible, was considerably worse than anyone in the council chamber had wanted to believe. They are not merely rebuilding, Ajuka reported, spreading the decoded documents across the council table with the grim precision of a man who had spent weeks hoping his analysis would prove wrong and had been steadily, methodically disappointed. They have already rebuilt. Cells embedded across at least 6 noble territories, resources funneled through shell operations that have gone entirely unnoticed by every intelligence network in this realm, including, I am ashamed to admit, my own. The attack on the Imperial Palace was not their opening move. It was a test, to gauge how quickly we would respond and how far our vigilance actually extended. And the results of that test, Serzex asked, though his expression suggested he had already guessed the answer. Suggest we responded slower and less thoroughly than they hoped we would not. Ajuka's mouth pressed into a thin line. They are, according to the intercepted fragments, preparing something considerably larger. A coordinated strike, timed to a date the fragments do not specify clearly, intended to eliminate what they term the corrupted lines of succession across multiple noble houses simultaneously. Prince Issei's name appears repeatedly, but he is not, it seems, their only target. Issei felt the weight of that settle over him with a coldness that no amount of Rias training had quite prepared him for. It was one thing to understand abstractly that he had become a target. It was another entirely to hear, stated plainly in a council chamber, that an entire strike had been planned around eliminating not merely himself, but an unknown number of others across the realm whose only crime, in the Concord's eyes, was failing to satisfy some ancient, arbitrary standard of bloodline purity. Who else, he asked? Do we know who else is at risk? Not with certainty. But the pattern of the fragments suggests targets among houses that have, in recent generations, incorporated adopted heirs, reincarnated devils risen from outside traditional bloodlines, or marriages the Concord would consider insufficiently pure by their own standards. Ajuka's gaze moved, briefly and with visible reluctance, toward Serzex. The Gremory house's own peerage practices place several of Lady Rias's closest circle within a similar category of risk, should the Concord decide to expand their definition of acceptable targets. The chamber went very still, and Issei felt something sharpen in his chest that had nothing to do with the boosted gear's dormant power, and everything to do with a fear considerably more personal than anything the council session had raised before. We need to warn them, he said, before he had entirely decided to speak. Not simply the Gremory house officially, through whatever channels the council considers appropriate. Rias needs to know directly, now, not after the proper committees have finished deliberating on the correct procedure for sharing intelligence. Serzex studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his easy diplomatic composure. You are asking to bypass established protocol. I am asking that people I care about not learn they are targets from a report filed 3 weeks after the fact because the correct forms had not yet been processed. Issei met his gaze steadily, aware he was pushing against exactly the kind of careful procedural caution his father had spent years teaching him to respect, and choosing, deliberately, to push anyway. I understand why protocol exists. I do not think protocol should come before warning someone that an enemy organized enough to infiltrate 6 noble territories may already know her name. It was Bahram who broke the tense silence that followed, his voice quiet but carrying the particular finality that ended most disputes in the council chamber before they could properly begin. My son is correct. The Emperor's gaze swept the table, daring anyone present to argue the point. We have spent this entire crisis discussing the Concord's strategy in terms of documents, patterns, and procedural analysis. Let us not forget that behind every fragment in that file is a person who deserves better than to learn they are hunted second-hand, through channels designed more to protect institutional caution than actual lives. Sirs, I trust you will not object if my son personally delivers what warning he can to your sister, tonight, rather than waiting for the Council's formal notification process to run its course. Sirs's expression eased into something that was, despite the gravity of the moment, faintly approving. I would object considerably more if he did not. Issei found Rias in the Gremory estate's private study that evening, curled into a chair with a strategy text she was clearly reading more out of habit than genuine attention, and the moment she saw his expression, whatever teasing greeting she had been preparing died on her lips. What happened? He told her everything, the decoded fragments, the scope of the planned strike, the specific mention of her own peerage practices among the patterns the Concord considered worth targeting, and watched her expression shift, over the course of the explanation, from alarm through something more focused and considerably steadier, the particular calm of someone who had been raised, much as he had, to meet danger with strategy rather than panic. You came to tell me yourself, she said, once he had finished. Rather than waiting for the Council's official notice. I did not think you should learn this from a report. He hesitated, then continued, more honestly than perhaps strict diplomatic protocol strictly required. I could not stand the thought of you finding out second-hand, 3 weeks from now, after something had already happened that a faster warning might have prevented. Something in her expression softened, the careful strategic focus giving way, briefly, to a warmth that had nothing to do with tactics or intelligence networks at all. Thank you? Truly. She set the strategy text aside, standing to face him properly, the distance between them shrinking to something considerably less formal than the moment technically called for. You are not the only target, though. If the Concord believes your existence threatens their entire worldview, striking at people close to you serves their purposes just as well as striking at you directly. You understand that, I hope. I do. And it terrifies me considerably more than anything they have tried against me personally. Issei met her gaze, letting the honesty sit between them without the careful composure he usually maintained in front of anyone outside his closest circle. I do not know how to protect everyone this threatens, Rias. I am still learning to protect myself properly. But I intend to try, whatever that costs, because the alternative, standing by while people I care about become collateral in a war fought over my own bloodline, is not something I am willing to accept simply because protocol suggests patience. Rias studied him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, there was a quiet, fierce determination in her voice that matched, exactly, the resolve settling into his own chest. Then we face it together. Whatever the Concord is planning, they will find considerably more resistance than they bargained for, if they believe an heir with no bloodline stands alone against them. Outside the study window, the first hints of an early autumn storm gathered over the Gremory estate's grounds, distant thunder rolling across territory that had, until that evening, felt entirely secure. Neither of them commented on the timing, but neither of them missed it either, the quiet, unspoken understanding settling between them that whatever season of relative peace they had both been allowed, it was, unmistakably, drawing to a close. The ambush came a week later, and unlike the assassination attempt on the palace, it came without any pretense of subtlety at all. Issei and Rias had traveled, with a modest escort, to a border territory shared between the Vashel and Gremory holdings, a diplomatic visit intended to formalize the informal alliance the two houses had been quietly building since the night he had warned her of the Concord's plans. It was meant to be a simple affair, a shared meal, a public gesture of unity meant to signal, to anyone watching, that the imperial throne and the Gremory house stood together regardless of what protocol, or old suspicion might otherwise suggest. The attack began the moment their carriage crossed the boundary marker into the shared territory, wards failing in a cascading pattern that Issei recognized immediately, with a cold, sinking certainty, as the same signature that had unmade the palace's defenses months earlier. They knew our route, Rias said, already on her feet, magic gathering at her fingertips with the sharp, practiced speed of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario more times than she probably wanted to admit. This was not opportunistic. Someone told them where we would be. Then we deal with that problem after we survive this one. Issei summoned the boosted gear, scales of red and gold settling around his forearm with considerably more speed and control than the desperate instinct of his first activation, and felt Drake's presence sharpen alongside his own, focused and ready. 6 months of Rias' exacting drills had changed a great deal about how that power answered him now. The escort formed a defensive perimeter around the carriage as robed figures emerged from the tree line in numbers considerably greater than the 3 who had breached the palace corridor, and Issei understood, in the first clash of magic and steel, that this was not a probing test the way the earlier attack had been. This was meant to succeed. Boost! The surge of power answered him instantly, deliberate rather than instinctive, and he moved to meet the nearest attacker with a control that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, deflecting a spell aimed at the carriage and countering with a burst of augmented strength that sent his opponent sprawling. Beside him, Rias fought with a fierce, elegant precision that matched her sharp intelligence exactly, destruction magic carving through the attacker's formation with devastating efficiency. There, she called, pointing toward a figure hanging back from the main assault, robed like the others but positioned with the careful distance of someone directing rather than participating. That one is commanding the others. If we can reach them. Issei followed her gaze and felt something settle into focus, the same clarity Rhea had spent months trying to teach him, the ability to see not merely the immediate threat in front of him, but the shape of the battle as a whole. Cover me. He moved before she could argue, cutting through the chaos of the fight with Drake's boosted strength driving him forward, and the robed commander, apparently unprepared for a direct challenge from the very target the entire ambush had been organized around, took a half-step back before recovering into a defensive stance. The foundling prince, the commander said, voice distorted by the same masking spell the earlier attackers had worn, though something in the cadence of it struck Issei as older, more deliberate than mere fanaticism. Come to die on schedule, then. How considerate. I came to ask you a question, actually. Issei kept the boosted gear humming at the ready, watching the commander's stance for any sign of the attack he expected to come. Your entire ideology rests on the idea that bloodline determines worth. That the old primordial courts had it right, and everything built since has been a corruption worth correcting by force. I would like to understand why you believe that, genuinely, rather than simply fighting you without ever asking. The commander's stance flickered, just slightly, something like surprise breaking through the careful menace of the moment. You waste breath on philosophy in the middle of a battle. I waste breath trying to understand an enemy who has decided my existence alone is reason enough to kill dozens of people who never asked to be caught in this fight. Issei's voice hardened, the careful diplomatic patience he had learned in the council chamber giving way to something sharper, more genuinely furious than he usually allowed himself to show. You speak of purity and correction, but all I have seen from your organization is fear dressed up as principle. Fear that a world where worth is earned rather than inherited might actually work, might actually be stronger than whatever fragile hierarchy you are so desperate to protect. You understand nothing, the commander snapped, and this time the attack came, a burst of dark, corrosive magic aimed directly at him with considerably more force than anything the earlier attackers had managed. Issei met it with the gear's full boosted strength, the golden gauntlet flaring bright as the two forces collided, and for a long moment the outcome hung genuinely uncertain, raw power straining against raw power in a contest that 6 months earlier he would certainly have lost. He did not lose it now. The corrosive magic shattered, and the commander staggered back, robes singed and defensive wards cracking under the force of the counterstrike, giving Issei just enough of an opening to close the distance and end the confrontation with a controlled, decisive strike that left his opponent unconscious rather than dead, a distinction he made deliberately, remembering, even in the heat of battle, his father's careful lessons about the difference between justice and vengeance. The remaining attackers, seeing their commander fall, broke formation and retreated into the tree line, and the escort, battered but largely intact, began the careful work of securing the perimeter and tending to the wounded. Rias found him a few minutes later, breathing hard but steady, standing over the unconscious commander with an expression more troubled than triumphant. "You held back," she observed, studying the captured commander rather than the visible relief of having survived. "You could have ended that fight faster, more decisively, and you chose restraint instead, even mid-battle. I wanted answers more than I wanted a body." Issei knelt beside the fallen commander, carefully securing the restraints Grafia had insisted his escort always carry, precisely for a moment like this one. Whatever this person believes, whatever twisted logic the Concord has built their entire ideology around, they are still a person who chose this path rather than simply being born into it beyond hope of change. I would rather understand what convinced them, than simply add one more body to a conflict that has already cost this realm too much. Rias studied him for a long moment, something quietly, deeply admiring settling into her expression despite the exhaustion and adrenaline still visible in the tight line of her shoulders. "My brother told me once that the difference between a ruler people fear and a ruler people actually follow is exactly this. The willingness to seek understanding even when victory alone would be so much simpler." She offered him a hand, helping him back to his feet amid the wreckage of the ambush. "I think, Issei, you are going to be very difficult for the Concord to fight, precisely because you refuse to become the kind of enemy their entire ideology assumes you must be." Behind them, as the escort finished securing the perimeter and preparing to transport their prisoner back to imperial custody for questioning, either of them noticed a second, more distant figure watching from the far tree line, robed and silent, who had come not to fight, but simply to observe, and who slipped away into the gathering dusk long before anyone thought to look for a witness who had never intended to be found. The captured commander, once questioned through the careful, lawful channels the council had insisted upon rather than any of the harsher methods a less patient regime might have preferred, proved to be considerably more forthcoming than anyone had expected, though not for reasons that brought Issei much comfort. "His name is Vale Corvain," Ajuka reported, several days after the ambush, spreading a fresh set of notes across the same council table that had hosted so many grim revelations over the past several months. A mid-ranking commander within the Concord's operational structure, not senior enough to know the identity of their true leadership, but senior enough to confirm several things we suspected and reveal a few we had not. Such as, Bahram asked? Such as the fact that the ambush was never intended primarily to succeed as an assassination. It was intended, according to Corvain's own account, to test Prince Issei's capabilities directly, in a controlled engagement where the Concord could observe his growth firsthand and adjust their larger strike accordingly. Ajuka's expression tightened. They are, in effect, treating him as a known variable to be measured and planned around, rather than an obstacle to be eliminated at the first opportunity. That is, in some ways, more concerning than simple aggression would be. It suggests a patience and a long view that a merely fanatical organization rarely possesses. Issei absorbed that with a chill that had nothing to do with the training ground's temperature, remembering the second figure Rias had mentioned noticing at the edge of the tree line, distant and watching, who had vanished before anyone could pursue. He had assumed, in the aftermath of the fight, that it had simply been a scout covering the retreat. Ajuka's report suggested something considerably more deliberate. They wanted to see what I could do. They wanted to see what you could do, and more importantly, how you chose to do it. Ajuka met his gaze directly. Corvain specifically mentioned that his superiors expressed interest, following the ambush, in your decision to capture rather than kill him, and in the conversation you attempted before the fighting properly began. They are studying not merely your strength, Prince Issei, but your character, and I confess I do not yet fully understand what conclusion they intend to draw from it. Seraphal Leviathan, who had grown steadily less dismissive of Issei over the preceding months, leaned forward with an expression more troubled than her usual sharp skepticism. That suggests they see something in him worth more careful consideration than a simple obstacle marked for elimination. Which is either good news, because it might mean he has bought this realm more time than a straightforward assassination attempt would have allowed, or considerably worse news, if it means they are looking for a way to use him rather than simply remove him. Use him how? Sirzex asked. I do not know, Serafal admitted. But an organization patient enough to spend 4 centuries rebuilding in the shadows, patient enough to test rather than simply strike, is not an organization that abandons a valuable asset lightly, once they have identified one. I would suggest strongly that the imperial household consider what leverage the Concord might believe they hold, or might attempt to create, before this crisis progresses any further. The meeting stretched long into the evening, the council working through contingencies and countermeasures with a thoroughness that left Issei simultaneously reassured by the careful attention being paid to his safety, and uncomfortably aware of exactly how large a shadow he had become in the middle of a conflict considerably bigger than himself. It was Bahram who found him afterward, in the quiet of the North Garden where so many of their most important conversations had unfolded over the years, the black roses catching the last silver light of evening in a way that had, over 16 years, become as familiar to Issei as his own reflection. You are troubled, his father observed, settling onto the bench beside him with the particular careful weariness of a monarch who had spent an entire day fielding the realm's anxieties on his son's behalf. They are studying me. Not simply trying to kill me, but trying to understand what I am, what I might become, whether I am a threat worth removing or a variable worth accounting for in whatever larger plan they are building. Issei stared out at the roses without quite seeing them. I do not know which possibility frightens me more. Both should frighten you a little. That is not weakness, Issei. It is simply honesty about the stakes. Bahram's voice carried the same steady calm it always had, the anchor that had held Issei's world together since the night Grafia first carried him through the palace doors. But I would remind you of something I told you the night the boosted gear first answered you. You did not summon that power on command in a controlled exercise. It answered when your life depended on it, and it has grown, in the months since, not because fear demanded it, but because you chose, deliberately, to become someone worth that power. The Concord can study you all they wish. They cannot study a choice you have not yet made, because you are the only one who gets to make it. And if they find a way to use that against me? Serafal seemed to believe that was a real possibility. Then we will face it, together, the same way we have faced everything else since the day I found you in Grafia's arms. Bahram turned to face him fully, something old and fiercely protective settling behind his ancient eyes. I did not raise you to be a weapon for this realm to wield, Issei, nor a variable for an enemy to solve. I raised you to be a person capable of choosing, again and again, who you intend to be, regardless of what anyone else, friend or enemy, believes that choice should look like. Whatever the Concord is planning, whatever leverage they believe they might find, I trust you to keep choosing well. I have watched you do exactly that, every single time this past year has tested you. Issei let his father's words settle over him slowly, the way he had learned, over years of quiet evenings in this same garden, to let his father's counsel settle rather than simply accepting it at face value. There was comfort in it, real and steadying, but underneath the comfort sat a colder clarity he could not quite shake, the growing certainty that whatever the Concord intended to attempt next, it would not arrive as another blunt assassination attempt in a palace corridor or a border ambush. It would arrive, he suspected, dressed in something considerably harder to see coming. Drake's voice rumbled up from the depths of his thoughts, quieter than usual, more thoughtful. Your father is right, partner, about the choosing. But Serafal is right too, about the leverage. An enemy patient enough to study rather than strike is an enemy planning something that depends on more than simply defeating you in open combat. I have fought beside hosts who faced exactly this kind of foe before. They rarely come at you with strength alone, when strength has already failed them once. They come for the people and the choices you care about most, and they use those to shape a battlefield you never agreed to fight on. Issei looked out at the black roses, thinking of Rias standing beside him amid the wreckage of the ambush, of his father's steady hand on his shoulder through every crisis this past year had brought, of Grafia's quiet, unwavering loyalty since the very first night of his life he could not remember but had been told about so many times it felt like memory anyway. Then I suppose, he said quietly, more to himself than to the dragon or the father seated beside him, I had better be ready to protect what they might try to use against me, and not merely myself. somewhere beyond the palace walls, in shadows that no council investigation had yet managed to fully illuminate, the Umber Concord continued its patient, careful work, content, for the moment, to watch and wait and study, while the season of open conflict gathered, slowly and inevitably, toward whatever storm it was building toward next. The formal alliance between the imperial throne and the Gremory house was announced 3 weeks later, in a ceremony considerably smaller and more deliberate than the sprawling political theater such occasions usually demanded, held not in the grand ceremonial hall the council had originally proposed, but in the same north garden where so much of Issei's life had quietly taken shape. You could have let the council plan something grander, Rias observed, standing beside him as the last of the invited witnesses, a careful mix of noble houses, Gregory representatives, and imperial household staff, settled into their places among the black roses. This is your first major public alliance since the council session. Most heirs would want the spectacle. Most heirs did not spend their entire life learning that the important decisions in this realm are made in quiet gardens rather than crowded halls. Issei glanced at her, allowing himself a small smile despite the formal weight of the occasion. Besides, I wanted the setting to mean something, rather than simply impress an audience that has already decided what it thinks of me regardless of the venue. The ceremony itself was brief, a formal exchange of terms between the imperial household and the Gremory house, mutual defense obligations, shared intelligence protocols regarding the Concord threat, and a public declaration, carefully worded by Grafia and reviewed twice by Serzex himself, that the two houses stood together against any faction that believed bloodline alone determined a person's worth or their right to safety within the realm. Bahram spoke last, his voice carrying easily across the garden with the quiet authority of 3 centuries of careful governance behind every word. I have ruled this realm since before most of you were born, he said, addressing the assembled witnesses with the particular gravity he reserved for moments that mattered beyond the immediate occasion. In all that time, I have watched alliances form and dissolve based on convenience, on fear, on the shifting calculations of houses more concerned with their own advancement than with the realm's actual stability. What we witness today is different, and I do not say that lightly. This alliance exists because 2 young people, my son among them, chose partnership over the safer, more insular path their own individual survival might have suggested. They chose to stand together not because protocol demanded it, but because they understood, better than many rulers twice their age, that the threat we face cannot be answered by houses guarding their own borders alone. He turned to Issei, something quietly proud settling into his ancient features that the formal occasion did nothing to diminish. When I found my son, he had no name, no lineage, and no claim to anything this realm considered valuable. I gave him a name, and a place, and I hoped, more than I ever let myself admit even to Grafia, that he would grow into someone capable of using both wisely. I did not expect, when I made that choice 16 years ago, that he would one day stand in this same garden and teach this entire realm something about what genuine partnership looks like, in a crisis that has tested every one of our old assumptions about worth and belonging. I could not be more proud of the choice I made, nor of the man that choice has become. Issei felt the weight of his father's words settle over him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the formal ceremony's requirements, and everything to do with 16 years of quiet evenings, patient lessons, and steady, unwavering faith that had brought him to exactly this moment. He glanced at Rias, found her watching him with an expression that mirrored, exactly, the warmth in his own chest, and understood, with a clarity that felt entirely separate from the ceremony's careful choreography, that whatever the Concord intended to attempt next, he would not face it as a nameless foundling standing alone against the realm's judgment. He would face it as his father's son, and as Rias Gremory's ally, and as whatever else the months and years ahead chose to make of him, built one deliberate, honest choice at a time. That evening, once the last of the formal witnesses had departed and the garden had settled back into its familiar, quiet stillness, Issei found himself alone with Rias for a rare unguarded moment, the black roses closing their petals against the coming night in the same slow ritual he had watched, without fully understanding it, every evening of his childhood. Your father's speech surprised me, Rias said, settling onto the bench beside him with none of the formal distance the day's ceremony had required. I had not realized how much he actually says, when he finally decides to say it. He does not waste words. He never has. It makes the ones he chooses to spend feel considerably heavier than they might from someone less careful. Issei looked out at the closing roses, turning the day's events over the way his father had taught him to turn over anything worth keeping. I keep thinking about what he said, about teaching the realm what partnership looks like. I do not know if I believe we have taught anyone anything yet. The Concord is still out there, still patient, still studying whatever weakness they believe they can find in an alliance like this one. Then we prove them wrong the same way you have proven every doubter wrong since the day you walked into that first council session terrified and answered every hostile question with more honesty than anyone expected. Rias's hand found his, warm and steady in the cooling evening air, and neither of them commented on the gesture, though either of them pulled away from it either. The Concord believes strength comes from purity, from bloodlines kept carefully separate, and ranked according to some ancient hierarchy that stopped mattering the moment this realm decided worth should be earned rather than inherited. Let them keep believing that, right up until an alliance built on exactly the opposite principle proves strong enough to end whatever they are planning. Issei looked at her for a long moment, the last of the day's ceremonial weight giving way to something quieter and considerably more personal, and found himself, not for the first time, deeply grateful that whatever the future intended to demand of him, he would not be asked to face it alone. Together, then, he said. Together, she agreed, and somewhere in the depths of his own thoughts, Drake's low, rumbling voice offered a rare, warm approval that required no further translation. Far beyond the palace walls, in a chamber no council investigation had yet located, a figure cloaked in shadow studied a report detailing the day's ceremony with an expression that revealed nothing to the small circle of subordinates awaiting instruction. The alliance proceeds as we anticipated, the figure said finally, setting the report aside with the unhurried patience of someone who had already spent 4 centuries waiting and saw no particular urgency in the months still ahead. Let them build their partnership. Let them believe an alliance forged in a garden of black roses is strength enough to withstand what comes next. We have waited a very long time for the right foundling to sit upon that throne, and patience, more than strength, has always been the Concord's truest weapon. The subordinates said nothing, waiting for instruction that did not yet come, and in the gathering dark beyond Pandemonium's careful borders, the season of quiet preparation drew, slowly and deliberately, toward its close. Vale Corvain, still recovering under careful guard within the imperial household's most secure holding chamber, proved to have exactly one more piece of information worth extracting before his usefulness to the investigation ran its course, and it was, Ajuka reported grimly, considerably more than anyone in the council had hoped to hear. He does not know the sovereign's true name, Ajuka said, laying out the last of Corvain's statements across the council table with the weary precision of a man who had spent weeks hoping for a breakthrough and finding, instead, only a deeper and more troubling shape to the problem. Few within the Concord structure do. But he confirmed the title itself. The organization is led by someone who calls himself the first sovereign, a claim of direct descent from the primordial devil courts that predate the current Satan system entirely, and Corvain believes, based on things he was told rather than shown, that the claim may not be empty posturing. An actual primordial bloodline, Sirzek said slowly, surviving 4 centuries and hiding. It would explain a great deal. The patience, the long view, the willingness to study rather than strike outright. A being who has already survived the fall of an entire age does not panic simply because a single test engagement did not go entirely to plan. Ajuka's gaze moved to Bahram, who had gone very still at the mention of the primordial courts in a way that Issei, watching closely, recognized as significant. Your Majesty. You lived through the final years of that age, before the reforms. Does the title mean anything to you specifically? Bahram was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an old, careful weight that Issei had rarely heard from him even in the gravest council sessions of the past year. The first sovereign was not merely a title of lineage. It was the seat occupied by whichever primordial devil could claim the oldest unbroken bloodline recognized by the courts, a position of ceremonial authority above even the strongest war leaders of that age, precisely because it represented purity of descent rather than strength of arms. He folded his hands atop the table, his expression distant in a way that suggested memories considerably older than anyone else in the chamber could share. The line was believed extinguished during the final war, its last claimant killed in the collapse that ended the old courts, and made room for the Satan system to rise in their place. If someone has resurrected that title, either through genuine descent or through claiming it falsely to lend their movement legitimacy, they are telling us something important about what they believe they are owed. What do they believe they are owed? Issei asked. Everything, his father said simply. The throne of Pandemonium included. In the old order, the first sovereign held ceremonial primacy over every seat in the realm, including the one I currently occupy, which existed then as a considerably smaller regional authority beneath the primordial court's broader structure. If this sovereign genuinely believes their claim, they do not see the Umbra Concord's campaign as mere ideological correction. They see it as the rightful reclamation of an inheritance they believe was stolen from them when the old order fell. The chamber absorbed that in a silence heavier than any that had preceded it during the entire crisis, and Issei felt the shape of the conflict shift beneath him, from a dangerous but comprehensible campaign of bloodline extremism into something considerably older and more personal, a war over a throne his father had spent 3 centuries building into something worth protecting, waged by someone who believed it had never rightfully belonged to him at all. Then this was never truly about me, Issei said slowly. Not entirely. I am simply the most visible symbol of everything the sovereign believes has gone wrong with this realm. An heir with no bloodline, sitting where they believe only pure descent should sit. You are the symbol, Bahram agreed. But do not mistake symbolic value for the whole of their intention. Symbols can be removed, Issei, and a throne reclaimed regardless of who currently sits upon it. If the sovereign's claim is genuine, or even convincingly performed, they intend to take considerably more from this realm than simply your life. Seraphal Leviathan, who had spent the better part of the past year growing steadily more invested in the crisis than her initial skepticism had suggested she would, leaned forward with an expression that mixed genuine alarm with the sharp, focused calculation of someone already working through contingencies. If the fragments Azazel provided are accurate, and Corvain's testimony now confirms a coordinated strike is coming, we are no longer discussing an isolated threat to the imperial household. We are discussing a claimant to supreme authority over the entire underworld, prepared to strike at multiple noble houses simultaneously to clear the path toward whatever restoration they believe they are owed. Then we cannot fight this as separate crises any longer, Sirzek said, his easy diplomatic composure giving way, for the first time in the entire investigation, to something genuinely urgent. The imperial throne, the Satan Council, the noble houses at risk, and any allies willing to stand with us. If the sovereign intends a strike broad enough to reclaim an entire order, our response must be broad enough to meet it, or we risk losing considerably more than any single battle. Bahram rose from his seat, and something in the unhurried certainty of the movement drew every eye in the chamber toward him. 3 centuries of quiet, careful governance crystallizing, in that moment, into the kind of decisive authority that had first built the peace this realm now stood ready to defend. Then let us build that response properly, the Emperor said. Sirzek, I want every noble house identified as a potential target brought into full coordination with the imperial household's own defenses, regardless of old rivalries or lingering suspicion. Ajuka, continue working Corvain's testimony for any detail that might reveal the sovereign's location before they choose the timing of their strike rather than allowing us to choose it for them. Seraphal, reach out to the angel faction through whatever channels remain open to us. If the Gregory were willing to share intelligence once the stakes became clear, Michael's people may prove equally willing, given what a restored primordial claimant would mean for the balance every faction in this realm currently depends upon. And Issei, Sirzek asked? Bahram turned to his son, and for a moment the weight of 3 centuries and the weight of 16 years of careful, deliberate raising both settled into his ancient gaze at once. Issei, he said, continues his training, faster and harder than we have yet asked of him. If the sovereign intends to reclaim a throne through a claimant's bloodline, then let him watch what a name with no bloodline at all is capable of building, when given the chance to become something worth defending. Drake's voice rumbled up from the depths of Issei's thoughts as the council session finally broke, quiet and thoughtful in a way that carried more weight than its usual dry humor. A primordial claimant, partner. I fought in that age once, longer ago than even your father remembers clearly. The old courts were not kind to anyone who did not already hold power, and the first sovereign's seat was built entirely on the idea that some blood simply mattered more than others by right of birth alone. If this sovereign is genuine, or even close enough to genuine to convince their followers, we are no longer simply defending a throne. We are defending the entire idea that the world your father built, however imperfectly, is worth keeping over the one it replaced. Can we win that fight? I do not know, Drake admitted, with an honesty that Issei had learned, over the past year, to value more than easy reassurance ever could have offered. But I have chosen my host carefully across a very long life, partner, and I have rarely regretted the choice as little as I regret choosing you. Whatever is coming, I intend to be ready for it beside you, one boost at a time, exactly the way we have built everything else this past year. Issei looked out at the darkening sky beyond the council chamber's windows, feeling the shape of the conflict ahead settle over him with a weight considerably heavier than anything the past year had yet demanded, and found himself, despite the fear that weight carried, steadier than he might have expected. Then we had better get to work, he said. We have a sovereign to prove wrong. Rias' training regimen, already demanding by any reasonable standard, became something considerably closer to relentless in the weeks following the council's decision, and Issei found himself, more evenings than not, too exhausted to do much more than collapse onto the nearest available surface and let Drake's steady, rumbling commentary lull him toward whatever sleep his aching body could manage to find. You are close, Rhea told him, circling him in the training ground with the same clinical assessment she had brought to their very first session, though something in her expression now carried a genuine investment that had not been there a year earlier. Closer than any sacred gear user I have trained in this cycle. Balance breaker is not simply a matter of raw power, Prince Issei. It requires a synchronization between wielder and gear that most devils spend decades failing to achieve, if they achieve it at all. What am I missing? I do not know precisely. That is rather the nature of the threshold. It is not a technique I can teach you directly, the way I taught you to control your boosts or read a battlefield's shifting currents. It is a wall you either break through, or you do not, and no amount of external instruction can force that particular door open from the outside. Drake, listening as he always did, offered his own assessment once Rhea had dismissed him for the evening, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had been considering the question for rather longer than he usually let on. It is not a technique, partner, no. But it is not entirely a mystery either. Balance Breaker asks something specific of every host who reaches for it. It asks you to want the power not simply for what it lets you survive, but for what it lets you protect, fully and without reservation, the same way I told you deliberate calling required you to want the gear itself without a crisis forcing your hand. This is the same lesson, offered at a considerably higher price. I want to protect the realm. I want to protect my father, and Rias, and everyone the sovereign intends to hurt. I do not understand what is missing. Then perhaps you are still thinking of it as a duty rather than a choice you have made freely. Drake's voice softened, unusually gentle for a dragon who had spent most of the past year offering dry commentary and pointed observations in equal measure. Duty is heavy, partner, and it can carry a host a long way. But Balance Breaker asks for something lighter, and considerably harder to offer honestly. It asks whether you would choose this fight, this power, this whole difficult inheritance, even if no one ever asked it of you at all. Even if your father had never found you in that garden, and no council ever demanded you prove your worth to a realm that doubted you from the moment you arrived. Issei sat with that question for longer than he expected to, turning it over through a restless night and into the following morning's training session, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the answer that eventually settled into place surprised him more than the question itself had. He thought of the pastries he used to buy in the lower market district as a boy, the polite shopkeepers who had never known or cared what throne he might one day inherit. He thought of Graphia's steady, exacting care through every year of his childhood, offered not because duty demanded it but because she had chosen, deliberately, to love a nameless foundling as though he were her own. He thought of his father's patient evenings in the study, teaching him chess and diplomacy and the slow, difficult art of listening, not because an empire required an heir but because a man had looked at an abandoned child and decided, freely, that he wanted a son. And he thought of Rias, sharp and honest and entirely unimpressed by his title, who had chosen him as a friend and then as something more, not because an alliance demanded it, but because she had simply wanted to. He had spent so much of the past year thinking of his power as something owed to the realm in exchange for everything he had been given. Standing in the training ground the following morning, the golden warmth of the boosted gear settling around his forearm with its now familiar hum, he found himself, for the first time, simply wanting it. Not for duty. Not for the realm's judgment, or the council's approval, or even the sovereign's looming threat. Simply because it was his, freely chosen, the same way everything else worth having in his life had eventually become his own. Boost. The surge that answered him this time was different, deeper, a resonance that seemed to settle not merely around his forearm but through the whole of his frame, and Rhea, watching from the edge of the training ground, went very still as the golden light began, for the first time, to spread beyond the familiar shape of the gauntlet entirely. Now, Drake said, his voice carrying a warmth and satisfaction centuries in the making. Now you understand, partner. Let it come. The transformation that followed left Issei breathless in a way no amount of Rhea's exacting drills had quite prepared him for, scaled armor spreading in a cascade of red and gold across his shoulders, his chest, down the length of both arms, wings of light unfurling from his back with a low, resonant hum that seemed to shake the training ground's reinforced walls. When it finally settled, he stood transformed, armored in a manner that felt, despite its unfamiliar weight, entirely and unmistakably like an extension of himself rather than a costume borrowed for the occasion. Balance breaker, Rhea breathed, staring at him with an expression that had, for the first time in over a year of exacting, clinical training, genuinely lost its careful composure. Scale male. I have trained dozens of sacred gear users in my career, Prince Issei, and I have witnessed exactly two achieve this threshold in all that time. Issei flexed his armored hands, feeling power thrum through the scales with a clarity and control that made every previous month of training feel, in retrospect, like the careful, necessary groundwork for exactly this moment. Drake's voice, when it came again, carried a rare and genuine pride that required no embellishment. Welcome to the deep end, partner. This is what a Longinus was always meant to become, in the hands of a host willing to want it freely rather than simply carry it as a burden. The sovereign believes bloodline determines what a person is capable of becoming. Let us go show them, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how wrong that belief truly is. He held the transformation for as long as his body could sustain it, the armor eventually dissolving back into quiet dormancy as exhaustion finally caught up with the breakthrough, but even collapsed against the training ground's cool stone floor, breathing hard and grinning despite himself. Issei felt something settle into place that no amount of council approval or noble house recognition had ever quite managed to offer him. He was not merely surviving the inheritance he had been given. He was, finally and fully, choosing it. Word of the breakthrough reached his father before the evening meal, and Bahram found him still faintly glowing with the lingering warmth of the transformation, seated in the north garden with a satisfaction he made no effort to hide. Rhea tells me you have reached balance breaker, the Emperor said, settling onto the bench beside him with the same careful, unhurried grace he brought to every conversation that mattered. I have. How does it feel? Issei considered the question honestly, turning the day's revelation over the way his father had taught him to turn over anything worth keeping. Like I finally understand what Drake meant, about wanting something freely rather than carrying it because the world demands it of me. I did not break through today because I trained harder, or because I finally mastered some clever technique Rhea had been withholding. I broke through because I stopped treating this power as a debt I owed the realm, and started treating it as something I actually wanted, for its own sake, because it lets me protect what I have chosen to love. Bahram was quiet for a long moment, something deeply moved settling behind his ancient eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth that the formal weight of the crown rarely allowed him to show so plainly. That, he said, is precisely the lesson I hoped you would learn, though I confess I did not know how to teach it to you directly, any more than Rhea could. I could only hope that raising you with enough freedom to choose, again and again, would eventually lead you here on your own. He rested a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, the same gesture he had offered in the wreckage of the East Corridor a year earlier, though it carried a different weight now, pride rather than simple relief. The sovereign believes worth is inherited. You have just proven, in the clearest way this realm has seen in centuries, that worth is chosen, cultivated, and earned, one deliberate decision at a time. Whatever comes next, Issei, I do not think they are prepared for exactly how thoroughly you intend to prove that point. The Angel faction's response arrived considerably faster than Sarah Fall had dared to expect, delivered not through the cautious, layered diplomatic channels such an approach would ordinarily require, but through a personal letter bearing Michael's own seal, requesting a summit between representatives of all three factions within the week. That is either extremely promising or extremely alarming, Serzex observed, turning the letter over with the particular care diplomats reserved for messages that might mean either. Michael does not typically move this quickly on matters involving devil internal politics, however serious. If he is willing to convene a full tri-faction summit on this short notice, he believes the threat extends considerably further than our own borders. It did, as the summit itself would confirm within its opening hour. The meeting took place in neutral territory, a quiet estate maintained jointly by all three factions for exactly this purpose, and Issei found himself, for the first time in his life, seated across a table from representatives of angels, fallen angels, and devils simultaneously, a configuration so historically rare that even Grafia, accompanying him as part of the imperial delegation, seemed to regard the room with a wariness that had nothing to do with any immediate danger and everything to do with the sheer improbability of the gathering itself. Michael, seated at the angel's end of the table, carried himself with a gentle, measured authority that Issei had not entirely expected from someone whose reputation preceded him as considerably more severe. "Thank you for coming, Prince Issei," the Archangel said, his voice carrying a warmth that put several of the more nervous devil representatives visibly at ease. "I understand your presence here required no small measure of trust, given the history between our factions. I do not intend to waste that trust. I appreciate that, though I confess I am curious what brought the angels to this table so quickly." Azazel required considerably more convincing. A faint, almost amused smile crossed Michael's features. Azazel enjoys testing people before he trusts them. "I find that inefficient, particularly when time is a resource we can no longer afford to spend carelessly." His expression sobered, the warmth giving way to something more grave. "We have detected activity along the boundary between our realm and the Underworld consistent with a large-scale magical working, precisely the kind of preparation one might expect ahead of a coordinated strike intended to breach multiple defended locations simultaneously. My own intelligence had not yet connected it to a specific faction. Your council's report filled in the picture we were missing," the first sovereign, Bahram said from his seat beside Issei, his voice carrying the same old, careful weight it had held since the title was first spoken aloud in the council chamber. Michael's expression shifted, something old and troubled crossing his features. "That title is not unfamiliar to us either, Your Majesty, though I confess I had believed, as you did, that the lineage it once represented had been extinguished centuries ago. If someone has resurrected that claim, genuinely or otherwise, the implications extend well beyond devil internal politics. The old primordial order predated the current three-faction balance itself. A restoration, even a partial one, threatens the peace all three of our peoples have spent centuries building, however imperfectly." Azazel, seated at the Grigori's end of the table with considerably less formal posture than either of his counterparts, leaned forward with the sharp, restless energy of a man who had clearly already spent considerable time turning the problem over in his own mind. Which means, for the first time in longer than any of us care to admit, all three factions share an identical stake in the same outcome. I do not enjoy admitting when devils and angels are right about the same crisis simultaneously, but here we are. "What are you proposing?" Serzex asked. "A joint response," Michael said simply. "Shared intelligence, coordinated defense of the territories most likely to be targeted, and should it come to open conflict, a willingness from all three factions to commit forces rather than watching from a careful, self-interested distance while devils alone bear the cost of a threat that endangers considerably more than a single realm's internal order." The proposal, Radical by any historical standard, the three factions had established over centuries of uneasy, carefully managed peace, met with exactly the kind of cautious deliberation Issei had expected, representatives from each side raising concerns about jurisdiction, about the precedent such cooperation might set, about the practical difficulties of coordinating forces that had, within living memory for some at the table, actively fought one another in open war. It was Issei, eventually, who cut through the careful diplomatic hedging with the same directness that had first won Azazel's trust months earlier. "I understand the concerns," he said, drawing the table's attention with a composure that no longer felt borrowed or rehearsed the way it once had. "Centuries of suspicion do not dissolve simply because a shared threat has appeared. But consider what the sovereign is actually offering, as an alternative to whatever discomfort this cooperation requires. A return to an order where bloodline alone determines a person's worth, where the strongest and purest lineages hold power simply because they were born to it, and where any peace built on cooperation between different peoples, different factions, different kinds of belonging, is treated as corruption to be violently corrected. If that vision succeeds, even partially, it will not stop conveniently at the devil faction's borders, any more than the Concord's ideology has stopped there already. It threatens the entire premise that our three peoples can build something better than the endless cycle of dominance and correction the old primordial order represented." He paused, meeting Michael's gaze directly, then Azazel's, then finally Serzex's, aware that whatever he said next would likely shape the summit's outcome considerably more than any careful diplomatic phrasing could manage on its own. "I was found on a battlefield with no name, no lineage, and no claim to anything the old order would have recognized as worth protecting. Everything I have because people from different circumstances, different loyalties, different histories, chose to extend trust to me before I had earned it by any standard the sovereign would accept. I am asking this table to extend that same trust to one another, not because old suspicions have suddenly resolved themselves, but because the alternative, three factions each guarding their own borders while a claimant to primordial supremacy picks us off one at a time, serves the sovereign's purposes considerably better than any temporary discomfort this cooperation might cost us." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Graphia, watching from her position slightly behind the imperial delegation, allowed herself the smallest, most private flicker of pride. Michael spoke first, his gentle authority settling over the table with quiet finality. "The angels commit to full cooperation. Whatever discomfort old history creates between us, I would rather bear it than watch a claimant to the old order succeed simply because we were too proud to extend one another the trust this moment requires." "The Gregory agree," Azazel said, considerably faster than his usual pattern of testing every proposal before committing to it. "Besides, I have wanted an excuse to study primordial era magic up close for centuries. Purely for research purposes, of course." Serzex's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile despite the gravity of the moment. "The devil faction agrees as well, though I suspect that was never seriously in doubt, given who raised the proposal in the first place." He glanced at Issei, something quietly proud settling into his expression. "You have a talent for this, Prince Issei." "I do not say that lightly, nor often, to anyone outside my own peerage. I had a good teacher," Issei said, glancing briefly at his father, who inclined his head with the faintest, most private acknowledgement of the compliment. The summit continued long into the evening, the practical details of a joint tri-faction response taking shape across a table that had, within a single afternoon, accomplished something centuries of careful, incremental diplomacy had never quite managed on its own. By the time the delegations finally departed, tired but genuinely hopeful in a way none of them had expected to feel walking in, Issei found himself standing beside his father in the quiet evening air, watching representatives of three factions who had spent centuries treating one another with careful suspicion now exchanging the particular easy conversation of people who had just discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that cooperation was considerably less costly than the fear that had kept them apart for so long. "You did that," Bahram said quietly, watching the scene with an expression Issei had rarely seen on his father's ancient face, something that looked, more than anything else, like genuine wonder. "I have spent 3 centuries hoping for exactly this kind of cooperation between the factions, and never once found the right moment, or the right words to make it happen. You found both, in a single afternoon, simply by telling the truth about what you were asking for. I told them what I believed. I did not expect it to work quite this well. That is precisely why it worked, Issei. The sovereign builds their entire campaign on claims of inherited authority and ancient bloodline. You just showed 3 factions, in the clearest possible terms, what genuine authority actually looks like, earned freely rather than claimed by birthright alone. His father's hand settled briefly on his shoulder, the same gesture that had steadied him through every crisis of the past year. Whatever the sovereign intends to attempt next, I do not think they anticipated facing 3 factions united against them, rather than a single realm fighting alone. That, more than anything the Council's investigators have uncovered, may prove the decisive advantage this conflict requires. The sovereign strike, when it finally came, arrived exactly 3 weeks after the Tri-Faction Summit, and it arrived, as Ajuka's analysts had feared from the beginning, everywhere at once. Issei was in the training ground with Rhea, working through the last of a grueling balance breaker drill, when the first alarm sounded, followed within minutes by a cascade of others, each carrying the same grim signature that had haunted the past year's investigation, wards failing in coordinated patterns across territories that had, until that moment, felt entirely secure. Report, Bahram demanded, the moment the Imperial Household's Emergency Council assembled in the war room beneath the palace, a chamber Issei had only visited twice before in his life and never under circumstances this urgent. 6 locations simultaneously, Ajuka said, his voice tight with the particular controlled tension of a man watching a worst-case scenario unfold in real time despite months of careful preparation. The Gremory estate. The Citri territory. 2 lesser noble houses previously identified as at-risk targets. A Gregory research outpost near the boundary. And an angel monitoring station along the same border, which confirms this was never merely a devil internal matter, whatever the sovereign's original propaganda claimed. Issei felt his chest tighten at the mention of the Gremory estate, and Bahram, catching the shift in his son's expression, addressed it before Issei could voice the question himself. Rias is there, currently coordinating her own household's defense, according to the last report we received before communications began degrading under the attack's interference. The Emperor's voice remained steady, but Issei recognized the careful control beneath it, the same discipline he had spent a year learning to recognize in himself. The Joint Response Network activates now, exactly as planned. Serzex will coordinate the Gremory defense personally. Serafal moves to reinforce the Citri territory. Azazel's forces already stand ready near the Gregory outpost, and Michael's angels are moving to secure their own station as we speak. And the 2 lesser houses? Reinforcements are already dispatched, though they will arrive with less speed than I would prefer. Bahram's expression tightened, the weight of 6 simultaneous crises settling visibly across his ancient features. We cannot be everywhere at once, Issei, however thoroughly we prepared for this moment. We must choose where our own strength does the most good, and trust the alliance we built to cover what we cannot reach ourselves. Then I am going to the Gremory estate. It was not, strictly, a request, and Bahram studied his son for a long moment, weighing the decision with the same careful consideration he brought to every choice that mattered, before finally nodding, once, with a certainty that carried no hesitation despite the danger the decision plainly invited. Go. Rhea, accompany him. Grafia, coordinate with Serzex's forces to ensure their arrival is synchronized rather than piecemeal. I will remain here to oversee the broader response and ensure no 7th target emerges that none of us anticipated. His gaze found Issei's one final time before the room dissolved into the organized chaos of a crisis finally, fully underway. Issei. Whatever you find there, remember everything you have learned this past year. Restraint where it serves you, decisive strength where it does not, and above all, come back to me afterward to tell me about it yourself. The journey to the Gremory estate, undertaken through an emergency transport circle that left Issei's stomach lurching considerably more than any of Rhea's training exercises ever had, deposited them directly into the middle of a battle already well underway, the estate's grand grounds transformed into a chaotic tangle of defensive magic, robed Concord attackers pressing against a defense that, while holding, showed clear signs of strain against numbers considerably larger than the border ambush months earlier had prepared anyone to expect. He found Rias near the estate's main hall, directing her own small but fiercely capable household staff with a focused, decisive command that reminded Issei, not for the first time, exactly why Serzex had once told him his sister possessed instincts considerably sharper than her age suggested she should. "You came," she said, relief flashing across her expression before the immediate demands of the battle pulled her focus back to the fight, destruction magic already gathering at her fingertips. "I told you we would face whatever came together." Issei summoned the boosted gear, scales settling around his forearm with the practiced ease of a year's dedicated training, and felt Drake's presence sharpen alongside his own, ready in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the deliberate choice he had made in the training ground weeks earlier. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I am genuinely glad to see you, which, given how much I enjoy pretending I do not need rescuing, should tell you exactly how seriously to take that assessment." Rias's dry humor did nothing to disguise the real strain beneath it, the estate's defenses visibly buckling under an assault considerably more coordinated and better resourced than anything the Concord had thrown at either of them individually. "They are not merely attacking. They are trying to break through to the estate's inner sanctum specifically. I do not think this is simply about eliminating my household, Issei. I think they want something inside." The realization settled over him with a cold, sharpening clarity, and Issei felt the pieces of the sovereign's broader strategy click into place with a certainty that left no room for doubt about what needed to happen next. "Then we make certain they do not reach it." Boost! The armor came faster this time than it ever had in training, red and gold scales cascading across his frame with a resonance that seemed to answer not merely his own will but the urgency of the moment itself. Wings of light unfurling behind him as the full weight of balance breaker settled into place for the first time in genuine combat rather than a controlled training exercise. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and considerable. Concord attackers who had pressed confidently against the estate's defenses moments earlier hesitated, visibly, at the sight of the transformed Imperial heir descending into the fight with a power that matched, in that instant, every fearful rumor the past year's conflict had generated about exactly what the foundling prince might eventually become. Issei did not give them time to recover from the hesitation. He moved through the attacking formation with a controlled, devastating efficiency that would have been impossible even weeks earlier, Drake's boosted strength answering every strike with a precision that came, he realized, somewhere in the fight's controlled fury, not from suppressing fear or forcing power through sheer will, but from the same simple, freely chosen want that had unlocked Balance Breaker in the first place. He was not fighting because duty demanded it. He was fighting because Rias stood beside him, because her household deserved better than to fall to an ideology that measured their worth by bloodline alone, because the alliance he had helped forge deserved to prove, decisively, that it was stronger than anything the old order could still muster against it. Rias fought beside him with the same fierce, elegant precision she always brought to battle, and together they carved a path through the attacking formation that, within a quarter hour, had transformed the Concord's confident assault into a desperate, faltering retreat, robed figures breaking and scattering toward the tree line as Serzex's reinforcements finally arrived to close the trap from the estate's far perimeter. By the time the last of the attackers had been captured or driven off, the Gremory estate's inner sanctum remained, against every apparent intention of the sovereign's carefully coordinated strike, entirely secure. Serzex found them both amid the wreckage of the estate's grounds, breathing hard but steady, and something in his expression, as he took in the full transformed weight of Issei's balance breaker for the first time, carried a mixture of relief and genuine, startled respect. "Scale male," he said. "I confess I did not expect you to reach that threshold quite this quickly, Prince Issei. Neither did I, until a few weeks ago." Issei let the armor dissolve, exhaustion settling over him in the familiar wake of the transformation's demands, though satisfaction settled alongside it in equal measure. "They were after something specific in the inner sanctum. Rias noticed it before I arrived. Do either of you know what that might be?" Serzex's expression sobered considerably, the relief of the battle's resolution giving way to a more careful, guarded concern. "The Gremory household holds several artifacts from the era before the current Satan system, inherited through a lineage considerably older than most current noble houses care to advertise. If the sovereign believed one of those artifacts held value to their broader claim, particularly anything connected to the primordial court's original authority. That would explain why this estate specifically drew such a concentrated assault, rather than simply being one target among several chosen at random. Rias's expression tightened, something troubled settling behind her sharp, assessing gaze. There is an artifact. A sealed relic my family has held since before the reforms, never studied closely because the seals on it have always resisted every attempt at analysis. I always assumed it was simply an old curiosity, kept more for tradition than genuine significance. Perhaps it is time we found out otherwise, Issei said, before the sovereign decides to try again with considerably more force behind the next attempt. The relic, once retrieved from the Gremory estate's most heavily warded vault and transported under joint Imperial and Satan Council guard to Ajuka's own research facility, proved considerably more significant than even Rias's cautious warning had suggested. It is a binding seal, Ajuka reported, 3 days into an analysis that had visibly worn on him more than any previous stage of the investigation, his usual careful composure fraying at the edges in a way Issei had rarely witnessed. Not merely old. Primordial, in the most literal sense, crafted using techniques that predate even the oldest magical traditions currently practiced by any of the 3 factions. And it is not decorative, or ceremonial, or simply a curiosity your family happened to inherit, Lady Rias. It is actively containing something. Containing what? Bahram asked, his voice carrying the same old, careful weight it had held since the sovereign's title was first spoken aloud months earlier. I do not know precisely. The seal resists analysis as thoroughly as it apparently resisted every previous generation's curiosity, and I am hesitant to press harder without understanding considerably more about what breaking it might release. Ajuka spread a series of diagrams across the table, the intricate primordial script covering the relic's surface rendered in careful, painstaking detail. But I can tell you this much with confidence. Whatever it contains, it was sealed away during the final years of the old primordial courts, around the same period the historical record places the first sovereign's supposed death. The timing is not, I think, coincidental. The implication settled over the gathered council with a weight that Issei felt in his chest before his mind had fully processed the reasoning behind it. You believe the sovereign is not simply claiming an inherited title. You believe they are trying to recover something specific, something bound away during the very collapse that supposedly ended their bloodline. I believe it is a strong possibility, yes. Ajuka's expression remained carefully measured, but the tension beneath it had not eased. If the first sovereign's line was not entirely extinguished during the old court's fall, but rather forced into hiding while something crucial to their authority, a source of power, a founding artifact, perhaps even a captured rival from that final conflict, was sealed away by the victors to prevent exactly this kind of restoration, then the Concord's entire campaign over the past year may have been building toward recovering that seal specifically, rather than simply eliminating symbolic targets like Prince Issei. Rias, who had remained largely quiet through the analysis, finally spoke, her voice carrying a controlled tension that Issei recognized immediately as the particular calm she adopted when genuinely unsettled rather than merely cautious. My family has held this seal for 4 centuries without ever understanding what it actually was. If the Concord's entire strategy has been oriented toward recovering it, that means every attack this past year, the palace assault, the border ambush, even the coordinated strike 3 weeks ago, may have been building toward this specific goal all along, with Prince Issei's elimination as a valuable but secondary objective rather than the campaign's true center. That would explain a great deal, Sirzek said slowly. The patience. The willingness to test rather than commit fully to any single engagement. An organization confident enough in a long-term strategy does not need to rush a single confrontation, provided the larger objective remains within reach. Bahram studied the diagrams for a long moment, something old and troubled moving behind his ancient eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that drew every gaze in the chamber toward him. If my suspicion is correct, and I pray it is not, the collapse of the old primordial courts was not simply a political revolution that replaced one governing structure with another. It required, in its final act, the sealing away of something powerful enough that the architects of the current Satan system judged it too dangerous to destroy outright, and too dangerous to leave unguarded in the open. If that seal breaks, whatever it contains will not simply hand the sovereign a symbolic claim to authority. It may hand them power considerably beyond anything this realm's current defenses were built to withstand. The chamber absorbed that possibility in a silence heavier than any that had preceded it during the entire year-long crisis, and Issei felt the true shape of the conflict ahead settle over him with a clarity that made every previous confrontation, the palace assault, the border ambush, even the coordinated strike 3 weeks earlier, feel, in retrospect, like careful preliminary skirmishes ahead of a considerably larger battle still to come. Then we cannot allow the Concord to recover it, he said. Whatever it costs to keep that seal intact, or to destroy whatever it contains beyond any possibility of recovery, we cannot allow the sovereign to claim it. Agreed, Ajuka said. Though I would caution against destroying the seal carelessly, Prince Issei, until we understand considerably more about what breaking it might release into the realm regardless of who controls it afterward. An uncontrolled release could prove just as dangerous as a controlled one falling into the sovereign's hands. Then we study it carefully, but quickly, Bahram said, and we increase security around this facility to a standard this realm has not required since the height of the last true war. If the sovereign has spent an entire year building toward recovering this seal, they will not simply abandon the effort now that we understand its significance. If anything, understanding what we now know, they will move considerably faster, before we can develop a countermeasure. That evening, in the quiet of the North Garden, Issei found himself sitting with Rias amid the black roses, the weight of the day's revelation settling over both of them in a silence that needed no immediate words to fill it. For centuries, Rias said eventually, staring out at the closing blooms without quite seeing them. My family held that seal for 4 centuries, and no one ever thought to ask what it actually was. We simply accepted it as tradition, an old curiosity passed down because that is what families like mine do with things we no longer understand. I keep thinking about how easily the Concord could have simply asked us to hand it over, decades ago, before anyone realized its significance, and we might have given it to them without ever knowing what we had lost. You could not have known. None of us could have. Issei reached for her hand, the gesture familiar now in a way that required no hesitation between them. That is precisely why we caught it in time, though. Because your family kept it safe, even without understanding why, long enough for us to finally recognize its importance before the sovereign could recover it first. I suppose that is one way to look at it. She managed a small, tired smile, leaning into the quiet comfort of his presence beside her. Do you think we can actually stop them, Issei? Truly stop them, not simply delay whatever they are building toward for another few months before the next crisis arrives. He considered the question honestly, turning the day's revelations over the way his father had taught him to turn over anything worth keeping, weighing the fear that came easily against the steadier resolve that had, over the past year, become just as natural a response to danger as the fear itself. I do not know, he admitted. But I know we have 3 factions standing together now, where a year ago we had none. I know I have a power I chose freely, rather than simply carrying as a burden the realm demanded of me. And I know I have people beside me, you most of all, who make every single part of this fight feel worth facing, regardless of how uncertain the outcome remains. He met her gaze steadily, the black roses closing slowly around them in the gathering dusk. The sovereign is betting everything on the idea that inherited power always wins, eventually, against anything built freely and chosen deliberately. I intend to spend whatever this fight still requires of me proving, as thoroughly as I possibly can, exactly how wrong that bet truly is. Rias studied him for a long moment, something warm and fiercely determined settling into her expression despite the day's heavy revelations, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that matched his own exactly. Together, then? However this ends. Together, he agreed, and beneath the darkening sky above Pandemonium, with a sealed relic's ancient secret now weighing over the entire realm's future, the two of them sat quietly amid the roses, drawing what steadiness they could from each other ahead of whatever the sovereign intended to attempt next. The assault on Ajuka's research facility came 4 days later, and unlike every previous engagement in the year-long conflict, it arrived without any pretense of testing, probing, or careful, patient strategy at all. They are throwing everything at us, Ajuka reported, his voice tied over the emergency communication array as Issei, Rias, and a hastily assembled joint response force raced toward the facility through an emergency transport circle that left considerably less room for careful preparation than any previous engagement had allowed. Numbers considerably beyond anything we have faced before, and I am detecting a presence at the center of the assault that does not match any signature in our records. I believe, Prince Issei, that the Sovereign has finally decided to commit personally. The facility's grounds, when they arrived, had already transformed into a battlefield of a scale Issei had not yet witnessed in his young life, robed Concord forces pressing against a defense that included not merely Ajuka's own security detail but reinforcements drawn from all three factions. Angels and fallen angels fighting alongside devils in a configuration that would have seemed impossible a year earlier, and now unfolded with the practiced, coordinated efficiency of allies who had trained together, however briefly, for exactly this contingency. At the center of the assault, cutting through the joint defense with a controlled, devastating power that made even the facility's most experienced defenders visibly falter, stood a figure Issei recognized immediately, despite having never before laid eyes on them, from the sheer weight of ancient, primordial magic radiating off their presence like heat from an open flame. The Sovereign had come robed not in the concealing garments the Concord's rank and file favored, but in armor considerably older than anything Issei had encountered in a year of study under his father's careful tutelage, dark and ornate in a style that predated even the oldest devil traditions currently practiced, and when they turned to face the arriving reinforcements, the face beneath the armor's raised visor carried features that seemed, disturbingly, to shift slightly with every angle. Issei tried to study them from, as though the Sovereign's true appearance resisted being fixed in memory the same way the recovered sigil had once resisted magical analysis. The foundling prince, the Sovereign said, voice carrying an ancient, resonant weight that made the earlier masked commander's distorted speech seem, in retrospect, like a pale imitation of true authority. And the three factions, standing together against me, exactly as I suspected they eventually would once the stakes became clear enough to overcome their old suspicions of one another. How predictable, and yet, I confess, how disappointing. I had hoped for a worthier final test before I reclaim what was always rightfully mine. You will not reclaim anything, Issei said, summoning the boosted gear even as he spoke, scales settling into place with the practiced ease of a year's dedicated growth. Whatever you believe you are owed, this realm has spent 4 centuries building something better than the order you are trying to restore. We are not going to simply hand it back to you because you claim an old title and dress the theft up as inheritance. The Sovereign's expression, what little of it remained visible beneath the shifting uncertainty of their features, curved into something that might have been amusement, or might have been genuine, ancient contempt. Inheritance is not theft, boy. It is the natural order restored, the correction of an aberration that has allowed foundlings and mongrels and carefully cultivated alliances between peoples who should never have trusted one another to masquerade as genuine strength. I lived through the old order. I watched it fall to exactly the kind of soft, sentimental cooperation you are so proud of building, and I have spent 4 centuries in patient exile, waiting for the chance to prove, decisively, that it was never truly strength at all. Merely a fragile piece, waiting for someone patient enough to shatter it. Booze. Issei moved before the Sovereign had finished speaking, the full weight of balance breaker settling around him in a cascade of red and gold as he closed the distance with a speed that would have been impossible even weeks earlier, and the clash that followed shook the facility's grounds with a force that sent both Allied and Concord forces scrambling to widen the distance between themselves and the collision of 2 vastly disparate sources of power. The Sovereign met his charge with a casual, almost contemptuous ease that made Issei's chest tighten with a fear he had not felt since the earliest days of his training, ancient magic answering the boosted gear's boosted strike with a defense that barely seemed to strain against the impact at all. You have grown considerably, for someone who began this year as an untrained curiosity, the Sovereign observed, pressing forward with a counterattack that Issei only barely managed to deflect, the force of it driving him back several paces despite the full strength of his transformed armor. I confess I had not expected quite this much progress in so short a time. Perhaps there is some merit to this notion of freely chosen power after all, however inferior it remains to true inherited strength. Rias's destruction magic tore through the battlefield beside him, drawing the sovereign's attention just long enough for Issei to recover his footing, and beyond her, Azazel and a contingent of Gregory forces pressed against the Concord's flanking formations with a coordinated ferocity that, combined with Michael's angels securing the facility's outer perimeter, began, slowly, to shift the battle's broader momentum away from the sovereign's initial advantage. "You are not facing me alone," Issei said, gathering himself for another charge, Drake's presence sharpening alongside his own with a focused intensity that carried none of the dragon's usual dry humor. "That is precisely the mistake you keep making. You believe strength is something a single bloodline claims and holds alone. Every single person fighting beside me today chose to be here, freely, because they believe something better than your restoration is worth defending together. That is not a weakness for you to exploit. It is the exact thing your entire ideology cannot account for, and it is going to be the reason you lose this fight." The sovereign's amusement flickered, just slightly, into something considerably colder. "Bold words for a boy who still has not landed a single meaningful blow against me." He came again anyway, Drake's boosted strength driving the attack with a controlled fury that channeled everything the past year had taught him, restraint where it mattered, decisive strength where it did not, and the clash that followed, longer and more evenly matched than the first, finally drew a genuine crack across the ancient armor's shifting surface, the sovereign staggering back a step for the first time since the confrontation began. It was not enough to end the fight. But it was enough, watching the flicker of genuine surprise finally cross features that had, until that moment, carried nothing but ancient, contemptuous certainty, for Issei to understand that the battle ahead, however far from finished, was no longer entirely one-sided. "Interesting," the sovereign said, straightening, the shifting uncertainty of their features settling, briefly, into something that looked almost like respect before dissolving back into cold calculation. "Perhaps you are a worthier test than I initially credited. Unfortunately for you, Prince Issei, I did not come here today to settle this conflict fully. I came to test your growth, and to retrieve what your allies have so inconveniently secured beyond my immediate reach. Both objectives, I find, have been sufficiently accomplished for today's purposes." Before Issei could press the advantage further, the sovereign gestured, and the remaining Concord forces began a rapid, disciplined withdrawal, the ancient armored figure vanishing into a tear of dark, primordial magic that closed behind them before any of the joint response force could mount a pursuit. The facility's grounds fell quiet in the withdrawal's wake, joint forces from all three factions slowly lowering their guard as the immediate threat retreated, and Issei let the balance breaker's armor dissolve, exhaustion crashing over him in a wave considerably heavier than anything the training ground had ever demanded. Rias found him a moment later, her own exhaustion visible but her expression carrying a fierce, steady pride that did more to steady him than any amount of rest could have managed. "You hurt them. I saw it, the crack in their armor. That has never happened before, in any account of this conflict. It was not enough. No. But it was something, and something is considerably more than anyone managed against them before today." She helped him to his feet amid the wreckage of the battle, glancing toward the facility where Ajuka's team had already begun assessing the seal's condition following the assault. "The seal held? Ajuka confirms it," came the reply, the scientist himself emerging from the facility with an expression that mixed relief and grim, focused determination in equal measure. "They did not manage to breach it, though I confess it was considerably closer than I would have preferred. We need to move it to a more secure location immediately, and I would strongly recommend we accelerate our own research, given what we just witnessed. If that was merely the sovereign testing our defenses rather than committing fully, I do not want to imagine what a genuinely determined assault might accomplish." Issei looked out toward the tree line where the sovereign's forces had vanished, the ancient, contemptuous weight of their final words still settling uncomfortably in his chest, and felt the true scale of the fight still ahead of him settle into place with a clarity that made every previous confrontation feel, in hindsight, like careful preparation for exactly this moment. "Then let us make certain," he said, "that the next time they come, testing us costs them considerably more than a cracked breastplate and a hasty retreat." The council that convened in the aftermath of the facility assault carried a different weight than any that had preceded it over the past year. The abstract threat of a hidden sovereign and a patient, shadowy organization finally giving way to the concrete, undeniable reality of ancient power tested directly against the realm's best combined defenses, and found, if not defeated, at least no longer entirely untouchable. We have confirmation now, from multiple independent sources, that the sovereign's claim carries genuine primordial power behind it, whatever the truth of their lineage, Ajuka reported, his usual careful composure restored though the strain of the past weeks remained visible in the tightness around his eyes. That is, in some ways, worse news than confirming the claim was empty posturing would have been. But it is also, I think, more useful information than uncertainty ever was. We now know precisely what we are fighting, rather than guessing at shadows. And the seal, Sirzex asked? Relocated to a facility with security considerably beyond anything even my previous research center could offer, developed jointly with input from all three factions rather than devil resources alone. Ajuka allowed himself a small, tired note of satisfaction. Michael's people contributed angelic warcraft that predates even the primordial era in some respects, and Azazel's researchers have already made more progress toward understanding the seal's structure in a single week of collaborative analysis than my own team managed in the entire month prior. Whatever else this crisis has cost us, it has proven, decisively, that the cooperation Prince Issei proposed at the summit produces results none of our factions could achieve working alone. Bahram, seated at the head of the gathered council with the particular unhurried gravity that had steadied this realm through 3 centuries of crises considerably smaller than the one currently unfolding, turned his attention to his son with an expression that mixed pride and careful concern in equal measure. You landed a blow against the sovereign that no one else in this conflict has managed, he said. That is a genuine achievement, Issei, and I do not wish to diminish it. But I would be failing you as your father if I did not also ask, honestly, how you intend to close the considerable gap that still remains between a cracked breastplate and the decisive victory this realm will eventually require. Issei considered the question with the same careful weight his father always brought to matters that mattered, aware that the easy confidence of the battlefield's immediate aftermath had, in the days since, given way to a more sober reckoning with exactly how much further the fight ahead still stretched. I do not have a complete answer yet, he admitted. But I know a few things clearly enough to act on. The sovereign underestimated how quickly I could grow, and underestimated, more significantly, what 3 factions choosing to stand together could accomplish against a strategy built entirely around exploiting old divisions. Both of those advantages remain ours to build on, provided we do not grow complacent simply because the first direct confrontation ended in a retreat rather than a rout. What do you propose specifically? Sarah Fall asked, her sharp, focused attention carrying none of the skepticism she had once reserved almost exclusively for questioning his fitness to inherit anything at all. Continued training, faster and harder than even the past few months have demanded, with Rhea and with whatever additional instruction the other factions might be willing to offer, given how effectively their cooperation has already proven itself. Issei glanced toward Rias, seated beside her brother with the same focused, strategic attention she brought to every council session she attended. Continued research into the seal, with full cooperation between all 3 factions rather than devil resources working in isolation. And I think, a more aggressive effort to understand the sovereign themselves, rather than simply reacting to whatever strike they choose to launch next. Corvain gave us a title and confirmed the seal's significance. There may be more information available, from other captured Concord operatives, or from historical records predating the current Satan system, that could tell us considerably more about who this sovereign actually is beneath the shifting uncertainty of their armor, and what specific weakness we might exploit beyond simply matching them in raw strength. Bahram studied his son for a long moment, something quietly, deeply proud settling into his ancient features despite the gravity of the ongoing crisis. That is precisely the kind of thinking that turned this realm's defense from a single household's isolated struggle into a coalition capable of actually challenging a primordial claimant directly. I will authorize whatever resources the investigation requires, and I trust the other factions will do the same, given how thoroughly this cooperation has already justified itself. Michael's representative, present via a careful magical relay given the Archangel's own pressing responsibilities elsewhere, offered the Angel's agreement with the same gentle, measured warmth Michael himself had brought to the original summit. Azazel, attending in person with considerably less formal patience than his angelic counterpart, but no less genuine commitment, added his own enthusiastic agreement, already visibly eager to dig further into whatever primordial mysteries the investigation might yet uncover. The council session stretched long into the evening, the practical work of coordinating a considerably expanded investigation and training regimen taking shape across representatives from all three factions with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible before the crisis forced such cooperation into being. By the time it finally concluded, Issei found himself, for the first time since the sovereign's ancient, contemptuous words had first settled into his chest during the facility assault, genuinely hopeful about the shape of the fight still ahead, rather than merely determined to survive it. He found Rias afterward in the same quiet corridor outside the council chamber where so many of their most honest conversations had unfolded over the past year, her own exhaustion from the long session visible but her expression carrying the same steady, focused resolve that had first drawn him to her friendship years earlier. "You believe we can actually win this now?" she said, not quite a question, studying him with the sharp, assessing attention she had never entirely abandoned even after their friendship had grown into something considerably deeper. "I believe we have a considerably better chance than we did a month ago, when all we understood was that something ancient and patient wanted my life and possibly this entire realm's throne along with it." Issei leaned against the corridor wall, allowing himself, for the first time in days, a moment of genuine, unguarded tiredness rather than the careful composure the council chamber demanded. "I do not know if that chance is enough yet. But I know I am not facing it the way I would have a year ago, uncertain of my own power and uncertain, more than that, of whether I actually deserve the throne everyone kept telling me I had been given rather than earned. And now I know I earned it, the same way I earned Balance Breaker, and the same way I earned whatever trust this alliance has managed to build between three factions that spent centuries actively distrusting one another." He met her gaze steadily, the quiet corridor holding the particular intimate stillness that only seemed to settle between them in moments exactly like this one. "The sovereign believes inherited power always wins eventually, against anything built freely and chosen deliberately. I intend to keep proving them wrong, one deliberate choice at a time, for as long as this fight requires it of me." Rias studied him for a long moment, something warm and quietly certain settling into her expression, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular steady conviction that had, over the past year, become as familiar and grounding to him as his father's own patient counsel. "Then we keep choosing it together," she said. "Whatever the sovereign still has planned, and whatever it costs us before this is finally, properly finished." "Together," he agreed, and somewhere in the depths of his own thoughts, Drake's low, satisfied rumble offered its own quiet agreement, the ancient dragon settling into a patient readiness that mirrored, exactly, the steady resolve now carrying his young partner forward into whatever the conflict's next chapter intended to demand of them both. The weeks that followed the facility assault settled into a rhythm considerably more demanding than anything the previous year had asked of Issei, but also, he found, considerably more purposeful, the scattered, reactive urgency of the crisis's early months giving way to the focused, coordinated momentum of an alliance that had finally learned how to work together rather than merely agreeing, in principle. That cooperation was necessary. Rias' training intensified alongside contributions from instructors representing all three factions now, a rotation that left Issei sparring 1 week against techniques drawn from centuries of angelic combat discipline and the next against the considerably more chaotic, improvisational style Azazel's Gregory fighters favored, each new perspective sharpening his own instincts in ways that Rhea, for all her considerable skill, freely admitted she could not have provided working alone. "You are becoming difficult to categorize," she told him, midway through a session that had left them both considerably more winded than either particularly wanted to admit, which, given what we are fighting, I suspect is exactly the point. The sovereign built an entire ideology around the idea that power follows predictable, inherited patterns. You are becoming something their whole framework has no ready category for. The research into the seal progressed alongside the training, slower and more painstaking, but steady, joint teams from all three factions gradually piecing together fragments of primordial history that no single faction's records had preserved completely on their own. Ajuka reported, with cautious optimism that grew slightly less cautious with each passing week, that they were beginning to understand not merely what the seal contained, but how it had been constructed, knowledge that carried, alongside its scholarly interest, the promising possibility of eventually strengthening the binding well beyond anything the sovereign's forces had yet managed to threaten. And through it all, the investigation into the sovereign's true identity continued, drawing on captured Concord operatives, fragmentary historical records, and the careful, patient work of intelligence networks now sharing information across factional lines with a fluency that would have seemed impossible before the crisis forced it into being. "We have a name," Ajuka reported, during a council session that carried, for the first time in weeks, a note of genuine breakthrough rather than incremental progress. "Or rather, we have a name the sovereign held before they claimed the ancient title, recovered from historical fragments that survived the primordial court's collapse in considerably better condition than anyone expected to find in the Gregory's own archives, of all places." "Azazel found this?" Surzex asked, with the particular note of surprise that suggested this outcome had not been anyone's first prediction. "Azazel found this," Ajuka confirmed, with a faint, wry note of professional respect he rarely extended so readily. "The name recorded is Malvern Asherial, a minor claimant within the old primordial court's extended royal bloodline, not the direct heir the current sovereign title implies, but distant enough in succession that his survival during the collapse would have gone entirely unremarked. Precisely the kind of gap in the historical record that would let someone patient enough spend 4 centuries quietly consolidating a claim no one thought worth verifying too closely." Issei absorbed the name with a strange, unsettled clarity, the ancient, shifting uncertainty of the sovereign's features suddenly carrying, in his memory, the shape of an actual person rather than simply an abstract, primordial threat. A minor claimant. Not even the rightful heir by his own order's standards. "No," Barham said quietly, something old and grimly satisfied settling into his ancient voice. "Which means the sovereign's entire campaign rests on a claim that would not have survived scrutiny even under the very order he claims to be restoring. He is not reclaiming a stolen birthright, Issei. He is manufacturing one, for centuries in the making, built on the same fear and ambition that drives any usurper who has convinced himself, over enough time and enough isolation, that his own hunger for power constitutes a genuine, rightful inheritance. The revelation, shared carefully and deliberately across all 3 factions in the days that followed, did not end the conflict, nor did it diminish the very real, primordial power the sovereign had demonstrated at the research facility. But it shifted something subtle and important in how the alliance approached the fight ahead, the abstract terror of an ancient, inevitable restoration giving way to the more manageable understanding that they faced, beneath all the ceremonial armor and shifting, uncertain features. Simply a man who had spent 4 centuries convincing himself and an entire organization that his own ambition deserved to reshape the world in its image. "A name changes things," Rias observed, that evening in the North Garden, the black roses catching the last of a season's fading light and the same familiar ritual that had marked so many of their most important conversations over the years. "It is harder to believe in an inevitable, ancient order when you know the man claiming to represent it is simply another ambitious claimant who happened to survive a war others did not. It does not make him less dangerous. No. But it makes him considerably less mythic. And I think that matters more than it might seem to, for everyone fighting on our side of this conflict. It is one thing to feel like you are resisting the inevitable weight of history. It is another entirely to understand you are simply opposing one particularly patient, particularly ambitious man, who can be defeated the same way any determined, dangerous opponent can eventually be defeated." Rias's hand found his, warm and steady in the cooling evening air, a gesture that had, over the past months, become as natural and unremarkable as breathing, even as the warmth behind it remained entirely undiminished. "You have already cracked his armor once, Issei. Now that we know he is simply Malvern Asherial, rather than some inevitable primordial restoration, I do not think that crack is going to stay the only one for very much longer." Issei let her words settle over him, watching the roses close slowly against the gathering night, and found, despite the very real danger still ahead, a steadiness he would not have believed himself capable of a year earlier, when he had stood in the same garden as a boy who understood little beyond the vague, persistent question of what he actually was. Beneath the throne and the title and the careful expectations everyone around him seemed to carry, he knew now, with a clarity that no council session or training breakthrough alone could have taught him. He was his father's son, chosen freely rather than born into obligation. He was Drake's partner, bonded through instinct and deliberate, hard-won trust rather than mere inheritance. He was Rias Gremory's ally and, increasingly, something considerably more than an ally, bound to her not through any political alliance's cold calculation but through a friendship that had simply, steadily, grown into something neither of them had planned but both had come, freely, to choose. And he was, whatever Malvern Asherial and his 4 centuries of patient, ambitious grievance believed to the contrary, considerably more dangerous than any inherited bloodline alone could ever have made him, precisely because everything he carried, his power, his throne, his allies, and the quiet, steady love that had built the man he was slowly becoming, had been chosen, deliberately, rather than simply granted by an accident of birth, far beyond the palace's careful borders, in a chamber the joint intelligence networks of 3 factions had still not managed to locate. Malvern Asherial studied a report detailing his enemy's latest breakthrough with an expression that revealed, for the first time in 4 centuries of patient exile, something considerably closer to genuine unease than the calm, contemptuous certainty he had shown at the research facility. "They have my name," he said quietly, to the small circle of subordinates who had learned, over the years, to read the dangerous stillness beneath his composure far better than any outsider ever could. "A minor claimant, they will call me, once the realm at large learns what our enemies have uncovered. A pretender, dressing ambition in the language of inheritance." His hand tightened briefly around the report's edge. "Let them believe that changes anything. A name does not undo 4 centuries of patience, nor does it return what should have always been mine by right of the blood I still carry, however distant my place in that succession might once have been considered. If anything, this discovery will only hasten what comes next. We move forward the timeline. Let the foundling prince enjoy his small victories and his growing alliance a little longer. It will make the reckoning, when it finally arrives, considerably more satisfying to witness." The subordinates said nothing, waiting for the specific instructions that would follow, and beyond the chamber's hidden walls, in the gathering dark of a season now fully turned toward winter, the true shape of the sovereign's final ambitions began, at last, to stir toward its inevitable, long-delayed conclusion.